Well, you're going to full screen camera, I guess, for now. You can't even see him. He's over here. Anyone embarking on a project such as this must inevitably begin by asking whether it is really necessary to write yet another history of Nazi Germany. Surely we've had enough. Surely so much has already been written that there is little more to add. Undoubtedly, few historical topics have been the subject of such intensive research. The latest edition of the Standard Bibliography on Nazism, published by the indefatigable Michael Ruck in 2000, lists over 37,000 items. The first edition, which appeared in 1995, listed a mere 25,000. This startling increase in the number of titles is eloquent testimony to the continuing, never-ending outpouring of publications on the subject. No historian can hope to master even a major portion of such an overwhelming literature. And indeed, some have found the sheer volume of information that is available so daunting, so seemingly impossible to pull together, that they have given up in despair. As a result, there have, in fact, been surprisingly few attempts to write the history of the Third Reich on a large scale. True, recent years have seen the publication of some excellent brief synoptic surveys, notably by Norbert Frey and Ludolf Herbst. Some stimulating analytical treatments, particularly Detlef Pierkurt's Inside Nazi Germany, and some useful collections of documents, of which the 4-volume English-language anthology, edited with extensive commentaries by Jeremy Noakes, is outstanding. But the number of broad, general, large-scale histories of Nazi Germany that have been written for a general audience can be counted on the fingers of one hand. The first of these, and by far the most successful, was William L. Schirer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, published in 1960. Schirer's book has probably sold millions of copies in the 4 decades or more since its appearance. It has never gone out of print and remains the first port of call for many people who want a readable general history of Nazi Germany. There are good reasons for the book's success. Schirer was an American journalist who reported from Nazi Germany until the United States entered the war in December 1941, and he had a journalist's eye for the telling detail and the illuminating incident. His book is full of human interest, with many arresting quotations from the actors in the drama, and it is written with all the flair and style of a seasoned reporter's dispatches from the front. Yet, it was universally panned by professional historians. The emigre German scholar Klaus Epstein spoke for many when he pointed out that Schirer's book presented an unbelievably crude account of German history, making it all seem to lead up inevitably to the Nazi seizure of power. It had glaring gaps in its coverage. It concentrated far too much on high politics, foreign policy, and military events, and even in 1960, it was in no way abreast of current scholarship dealing with the Nazi period. Getting an account for half a century later, this comment is even more justified than it was in Epstein's day. For all its virtues, therefore, Schirer's book cannot really deliver a history of Nazi Germany that meets the demands of the early 21st century reader. An entirely different kind of survey was provided by the German political scientist Karl Dietrich Brechers, The German Dictatorship, published in 1969. This was the summation of Brecher's pioneering and still valuable studies of the fall of the Weimar Republic and the Nazi seizure of power, and it was strongest on the origins and growth of Nazism and its relation to German history, precisely those areas where Schirer was at his weakest. Nearly half of the book was devoted to these subjects. The rest contained somewhat less extensive coverage of the political structure of the Third Reich, foreign policy, economy and society, culture and the arts, the wartime regime, and the breakdown of the Nazi system. Despite this unevenness, its coverage is masterly and authoritative, and it remains a classic. The great virtue of Brecher's treatment is its analytical clarity and its determination to explain, account, and interpret everything it covers. It is a book that one can return to again and again with profit. However, it is not only uneven in its treatment of the subject, it is also avowedly academic in its approach. It is often hard going for the reader, and it has inevitably been overtaken by research in many areas during the past 3.5 decades. If Schirer represented the popular and Brecher the academic side of writing about Nazi Germany, then, recently, one author has successfully bridged the gap between the two. The British historian Ian Kershaw's 2-volume Hitler, successfully embeds Hitler's life in modern German history and shows how its rise and fall were linked to wider historical factors. But Kershaw's Hitler is not a history of Nazi Germany. Indeed, following Hitler's own increasing isolation during the war, its focus inevitably becomes progressively narrower as it goes on. It concentrates on the areas to which Hitler devoted most attention, namely foreign policy, war, and race. It cannot, by definition, adopt the perspectives of ordinary people or deal very much with the many areas with which Hitler was not directly concerned. One of the principal aims of the present book and its succeeding volumes, therefore, is to cover a wide range of major aspects of the history of the Third Reich, not only politics, diplomacy, and military affairs, but also society, the economy, racial policy, police and justice, literature, culture, and the arts, with a breadth that for various reasons is missing in earlier approaches, to bring these together and to show how they were related. The success of Kershaw's biography demonstrated that research into Nazi Germany is an international business. The most recent large-scale general account to appear of the subject has also been by a British historian, Michael Burleigh's The Third Reich, A New History. It brings home to readers right from the start the violence at the heart of the Nazi regime to an extent and degree that no other book manages to do. Too often, as Burleigh rightly complains, academic authors paint a somewhat bloodless, almost abstract picture of the Nazis, as if the theories and debates about them were more important than the people themselves. His book dramatically redresses the balance. Burleigh's major purpose was to deliver a moral history of the Third Reich. The Third Reich, A New History, concentrates mainly on mass murder, resistance and collaboration, political violence and coercion, crimes and atrocities. In doing so, it powerfully reasserts a vision of Nazi Germany as a totalitarian dictatorship that has too often been underplayed in recent years. But it omits any detailed consideration of foreign policy, military strategy, the economy, social change, culture and the arts, propaganda, women and the family, and many other aspects of Nazi Germany that have been the subject of recent research. Moreover, in prioritizing moral judgment, it has a tendency to downplay explanation and analysis. Nazi Germany, for example, is dismissed as guff, pretentious nonsense, and I'm sorry, did I say Nazi Germany? My bad, let me go reread the sentence. Nazi ideology, for example, is dismissed as guff, pretentious nonsense, and so on, to highlight the immorality of Germans abandoning their moral duty to think. But there is something to be said for a different approach that, like Bracher's, takes these ideas seriously, however repulsive or ridiculous they may seem to a modern reader, and explains how and why so many people in Germany came to believe them. This history tries to combine the virtues of previous accounts such as these. It is, in the first place, like Schirer's book, a narrative account. It aims to tell the story of the Third Reich in chronological order and to show how one thing led to another. Narrative history fell out of fashion for many years in the 1970s and 80s, as historians everywhere focused on analytical approaches derived mainly from the social sciences. But a variety of recent, large-scale narrative histories have shown that it can be done without sacrificing analytical rigor or explanatory power. Like Schirer, too, this book attempts to give voice to the people who lived throughout the years with which it deals. The partisan distortion of German historical scholarship under the Nazis, the cult of personality, and the veneration of the veneration of leadership by history writers in the Third Reich caused German historians after the Second World War to react by editing individual personalities out of history altogether. In the 1970s and 1980s, under the influence of modern social history, they were interested above all in broader structures and processes. The work this generated immeasurably advanced our understanding of Nazi Germany, but real human beings almost disappeared from view in the quest for intellectual understanding. So one of the purposes of the present work has been to put individuals back into the picture. And all the way through, I have tried to quote as much as possible from the writings and speeches of contemporaries and to juxtapose the broader narrative and analytical sweep of the book with the stories of the real men and women from the top of the regime down to the ordinary citizen who are caught up in the drama of events. Recounting the experience of individuals brings home, as nothing else can, the sheer complexity of the choices they had to make and the difficult and often opaque nature of the situations they confronted. Contemporaries could not see things as clearly as we can, with the gift of hindsight. They could not know in 1930 what was to come in 1933. They could not know in 1933 what was to come in 1939 or 42 or 45. If they had known, doubtless the choices they made would have been different. One of the greatest problems in writing history is to imagine oneself back in the world of the past with all the doubts and uncertainties people faced in dealing with a future that for the historian has also become the past. Developments that seem inevitable in retrospect were by no means so at the time, and in writing this book, I have tried to remind the reader repeatedly that things could easily have turned out very differently to the way they did at a number of points in the history of Germany in the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th. One of the things I bring up a lot that's very irritating is people pretend that like history is inevitable, because when we study history, it is inevitable because it's already happened, right? Like so people think like, oh, well, this was always going to happen or this always going to happen, but that's not true. Like, especially now, like things can go, either way. So it's very stupid that, it's frustrating. People need to be aware that like things can always get worse. Okay. Yeah. But, people make their own history, as Karl Marx once memorably observed, but not under conditions of their own choosing. Those conditions included not only the historical context in which they lived, but also the way in which they thought, the assumptions they acted upon, and the principles and beliefs that had formed their behavior. A central aim of this book is to recreate all these things for a modern readership and to remind readers that, to quote another well-known aphorism about history, aphorism about history, quote, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there," end quote. For all these reasons, it seems to me inappropriate for a work of history to indulge in the luxury of moral judgment. For one thing, it is unhistorical. For another, it is arrogant and presumptuous. I cannot know how I would have behaved if I had lived under the Third Reich, if only because, if I had lived then, I would have been a different person from the one I am now. Since the early 1990s, the historical study of Nazi Germany, and increasingly that of other subjects too, has been invaded by concepts and approaches derived from morality, religion, and the law. These might be appropriate for reaching a judgment on whether or not some individual or group should be awarded compensation for sufferings endured under the Nazis, or, on the other hand, forced to make restitution in some form or other for sufferings inflicted on others. And in these contexts, it is not only legitimate, but also important to apply them. But they do not belong in a work of history. As Ian Kershaw has remarked, quote, "From an outsider, a non-German who never experienced Nazism, it is perhaps too easy to criticize, to expect standards of behavior, which was well nigh impossible to attain in the circumstances," end quote. At this distance of time, the same principle holds good for the great majority of Germans, too. So I have tried as far as possible to avoid using language that carries a moral, religious, or ethical baggage with it. The purpose of this book is to understand. It is up to the reader to judge. Understanding how and why the Nazis came to power is as important today as it ever was, perhaps as memory fades, even more so. We need to get inside the minds of the Nazis themselves. We need to discover why their opponents failed to stop them. We need to grasp the nature and operation of the Nazi dictatorship once it was established. We need to figure out the processes through which the Third Reich plunged Europe and the world into a war of unparalleled ferocity that ended in its own cataclysmic collapse. There were other catastrophes in the first half of the 20th century, most notably, perhaps, the reign of terror unleashed by Stalin in Russia during the 1930s, but none has had such a profound or lasting effect. From its enthronement of racial discrimination and hatred at the center of its ideology to its launching of a ruthless and destructive war of conquest, the Third Reich has burned itself onto the modern world's consciousness as no other regime, perhaps fortunately, has ever managed to do. The story of how Germany, a stable and modern country, in less than a single lifetime led Europe into moral, physical, and cultural ruin and despair, is a story that has sobering lessons for us all. Lessons, again, which it is for the reader to take from this book, not for the writer to give. Part 2 of the preface. Good one. Explaining how this happened has occupied historians and commentators of many kinds since the very beginning. Dissident and emigre, how do I pronounce this word? Hold on. Émigré?
Émigré.
Émigré. Okay. Explaining how this happened has occupied historians and commentators of many kinds since the very beginning. Dissident and émigré intellectuals such as Conrad Hayden, Ernst Fraenkel, and Franz Neumann published analyses of the Nazi Party and the Third Reich during the 1930s and 40s that are still worth reading today and had a lasting effect in guiding the direction of research. But the first real attempt to put the Third Reich in its historical context after the event was written by the leading German historian of the day, Friedrich Meneck, immediately after the end of the Second World War. Meneck, fuck me, dude. I can't pronounce these goddamn fucking names. Can we just like translate these all into fucking American?
pronouncenames.com.
Meinecke.
Meinecke?
Meinecke.
I don't believe that, but okay. Meinecke blamed the rise of the Third Reich, above all, on Germany's growing obsession with world power from the late 19th century onwards, beginning with Bismarck and getting more intense in the age of Kaiser Wilhelm II and the First World War. A militaristic spirit has spread through Germany, he thought, giving the army a balefully decisive influence over the political situation. Germany had acquired impressive industrial might, but this had been achieved by an overconcentration on a narrowly technical education at the expense of broader moral and cultural instruction. Quote, "We were searching for what was positive in Hitler's work," end quote, wrote Meinecke of the educated upper-middle-class elite to which he belonged, and he was honest enough to add that they had found something they thought met the needs of the day. But it had all turned out to be an illusion. Looking back over a life long enough for him to remember the unification of Germany under Bismarck in 1871 and everything that happened between then and the fall of the Third Reich, Meinecke concluded tentatively that there was something flawed in the German nation-state from the very moment of its foundation in 1871. Meinecke's reflections, published in 1946, were as important for their limitations as for their brave attempt to rethink the political beliefs and aspirations of a lifetime. The old historian had stayed in Germany throughout the Third Reich, but, unlike many others, he had never joined the Nazi Party, nor had he written or worked on its behalf. But he was still limited by the perspectives of the liberal nationalism in which he had grown up. The catastrophe for him was, as the title of his 1946 Reflections put it, a German catastrophe, not a Jewish catastrophe, a European catastrophe, or world catastrophe. At the same time, he gave primacy, as German historians had long done, to diplomacy and international relations in bringing about the catastrophe, rather than in social, cultural, or economic factors. The problem for Meinecke lay essentially not in what he referred to in passing as the racial madness that had gripped Germany under the Nazis, but in the Third Reich's Machiavellian power politics and its launching of a bid for world domination that had eventually led to its own destruction. For all its inadequacies, Meinecke's attempt to understand raised a series of key questions which, as he predicted, have continued to occupy people ever since. How was it that an advanced and highly cultured nation such as Germany could give rise into the brutal forces of National Socialism so quickly and so easily? Why was there such little serious resistance to the Nazi takeover? How could an insignificant party of the radical right rise to power with such dramatic suddenness? Why did so many Germans fail to perceive the potentially disastrous consequences of ignoring the violent, racist, and murderous nature of the Nazi movement? Answers to these questions have varied widely over time between historians and commentators of different nationalities and from one political position to another. Nazism was only one of a number of violent and ruthless dictatorships established in Europe in the first half of the 20th century, a trend so widespread that one historian has referred to the Europe of this era as a dark continent. This raises, in turn, the questions of how far Nazism was rooted in German history and how far, on the other hand, it was the product of wider European developments, and the extent to which it shared central characteristics of its origins and rule with other European regimes of the time. Such comparative considerations suggest that it is questionable to assume that it was somehow less likely for an economically advanced and culturally sophisticated society to fall into an abyss of violence and destruction than it was for one that was less so. The fact that Germany had produced a Beethoven, Russia a Tolstoy, Italy a Verdi, or Spain a Cervantes, was wholly irrelevant to the fact that all these countries experienced brutal dictatorships in the 20th century. High cultural achievements across the centuries did not render a descent into political barbarism more inexplicable than their absence would have done. Culture and politics simply do not impinge on each other in so simple and direct a manner. If the experience of the Third Reich teaches us anything, it is that a love of great music, great art, and great literature does not provide people with any kind of moral or political immunization against violence, atrocity, or subservience to dictatorship. Indeed, many commentators on the left from the 1930s onwards argued that the advanced nature of German culture and society was itself the major cause of Nazism's triumph. The German economy was the most powerful in Europe, German society the most highly developed. Capitalist enterprise had reached an unprecedented scale and degree of organization in Germany. Marxists argued that this meant that class conflict between the owners of capital and those they exploited had been ratcheted up until it reached breaking point. Desperate to preserve their power and their profits, big businessmen and their hangers-on used all their influence and all the propagandist means at their disposal to call into being a mass movement that was dedicated to serving their interests, the Nazi Party, and then to lever it into power, and benefit from it once it was there. This view, elaborated with considerable sophistication by a whole variety of Marxist scholars from the 1920s to the 1980s, should not be dismissed out of hand as mere propaganda. It has inspired a wide range of substantial scholarly work over the years on both sides of the Iron Curtain that divided Europe during the Cold War between 1945 and 1990. But as a broad, general explanation, it begs many questions. It raises many questions. Not good. Sorry. It more or less ignored the racial doctrines of Nazism and altogether failed to explain the fact that the Nazis directed such venomous hatred towards the Jews, not only in rhetoric, but also in reality. Given the considerable resources devoted by the Third Reich to persecuting and destroying millions of people, including many who were impeccably middle class, productive, well-off, and in no small number of cases capitalists themselves, it's hard to see how the phenomenon of Nazism could be reduced to the product of class struggle against the proletariat or an attempt to preserve the capitalist system that so many Jews in Germany contributed to sustaining. Moreover, if Nazism was the inevitable outcome of the arrival of imperialistic monopoly capitalism, then how could one account for the fact that it only emerged in Germany and not in other similarly advanced capitalist economies like Britain, Belgium, or the United States? Just such a question was what many non-Germans asked during the Second World War, and at least some Germans posed to themselves immediately afterwards. Above all, in the countries that had already experienced one war against the Germans, 1914 to 1918, many commentators argued that the rise and triumph of Nazism were the inevitable and end products of centuries of German history. In this view, which was put forward by writers as varied as the American journalist William L. Shirer, the British historian A.J.P. Taylor, and the French scholar Edmond Vermeil, the Germans had always rejected democracy and human rights, abased themselves before strong leaders, rejected the concept of the active citizen, and indulged in vague but dangerous dreams of world domination. In a curious way, this echoes the Nazis' own version of German history, in which the Germans had also held by some kind of basic racial instinct to these fundamental traits, but had been alienated from them by foreign influences such as the French Revolution. But as many critics have pointed out, the simplistic view immediately raises the question of why the Germans did not succumb to a Nazi-style dictatorship long before 1933. It ignores the fact that there were very strong, liberal and democratic traditions in German history, traditions which found their expression in political upheavals such as the 1848 revolution, when authoritarian regimes were overthrown all over Germany. And it makes it harder, rather than easier, to explain how and why the Nazis came to power, because it ignores the very widespread opposition to Nazism, which existed in Germany even in 1933, and so prevents us from asking the crucial question of why that opposition was overcome. Without recognizing the existence of such opposition to Nazism within Germany itself, the dramatic story of Nazism's rise to dominance ceases to be a drama at all. It becomes merely the realization of the inevitable. It has been all too easy for historians to look back at the course of German history from the vantage point of 1933 and interpret almost anything that happened in it as contributing to the rise and triumph of Nazism. This has led to all kinds of distortions, with some historians picking choice quotations from German thinkers such as Herder, the late 18th century apostle of nationalism, or Martin Luther, the 16th century founder of Protestantism, to illustrate why they argue are ingrained German traits of contempt for other nationalities and blind obedience to authority within their own borders. It's interesting that he writes this because this is my same complaint about people that do Israel-Palestine, where they'll go back and they'll just quote mine like one or two things, sometimes like that aren't even relevant in the timelines. Like, oh, we knew that Israel wanted to take over everything in 67 or 48 because of this quote from Theodor Herzl, who died in like 1907. It's like, wait, what? How are you using these quotes? But it's because you can tell whatever story you want if you don't know any of the history or care about it, I guess. But yet, when we look more closely at the work of thinkers such as these, we discover that Herder preached tolerance and sympathy for other nationalities, while Luther famously insisted on the right of the individual conscience to rebel against spiritual and intellectual authority. Moreover, while ideas do have a power of their own, that power is always conditioned, however indirectly, by social and political circumstances, a fact that historians who generalized about the German character or the German mind all too often forget. A different current of thought, sometimes put forward by the same writers, has emphasized not the importance of ideology and belief in German history, but their unimportance. Germans, it has sometimes been said, had no real interest in politics and never got used to the give and take of democratic political debate. Yet, of all the myths of German history that have been mobilized to account for the coming of the Third Reich in 1933, none is less convincing than that of the unpolitical German. Largely the creation of the novelist Thomas Mann during the First World War, this concept subsequently became an alibi for the educated middle class in Germany, which could absolve itself from blame for supporting Nazism by accepting criticism for the far less serious offense of failing to oppose it. Historians of many varieties have claimed that the German middle class had withdrawn from political activity after the debacle of 1848 and taken refuge in money-making or literature, culture, and the arts instead. Educated Germans put efficiency and success above morality and ideology. Yet, there is plenty of evidence to the contrary, as we shall see in the course of this book. Whatever Germany suffered from in the 1920s, it was not a lack of political commitment and belief. Rather, if anything, the opposite. German historians, not surprisingly, found such broad and hostile generalizations about the German character highly objectionable. In the aftermath of the Second World War, they tried their best to deflect criticism by pointing to the wider European roots of Nazi ideology. They drew attention to the fact that Hitler himself was not German, but Austrian, and they adduced parallels with other European dictatorships of the age, from Mussolini's Italy to Stalin's Russia. Surely, they argued, in the light of the general collapse of European democracy in the years from 1917 to 1933, the coming of the Nazis should be seen not as the culmination of a long and uniquely German set of historical developments, but rather as the collapse of the established order in Germany as elsewhere under the cataclysmic impact of the First World War. In this view, the rise of industrial society brought the masses onto the political stage for the first time. The war destroyed social hierarchy, moral values, and economic stability right across Europe. The Habsburg, the German, the Tsarist, and the Ottoman empires all collapsed, and the new democratic states that emerged in their wake quickly fell victim to the demagogy, and the new democratic states that emerged in their wake quickly fell victim to the demagogy of unscrupulous agitators who seduced the masses into voting for their own enslavement. The 20th century became an age of totalitarianism, culminating in the attempt of Hitler and Stalin to establish a new kind of political order based on total police control, terror, and the ruthless suppression and murder of real or imagined opponents in their millions on the one hand, and continual mass mobilization and enthusiasm whipped up by sophisticated propaganda methods on the other. Although it is easy enough to see how such arguments served the interest of Western exponents of the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s by implicitly or explicitly equating Stalin's Russia with Hitler's Germany, the concept of both as varieties of a single phenomenon has recently undergone something of a revival. And certainly, there is nothing illegitimate about comparing the two regimes. The idea of totalitarianism as a general political phenomenon went back as far as the early 1920s. It was used in a positive sense by Mussolini, who, along with Hitler and Stalin, made the claim to a total control of society that involved the effective recreation of human nature in the form of a new type of human being. But whatever the similarities between these various regimes, the differences between the forces that lay behind the origins, rise, and eventual triumph of Nazism and Stalinism are too strikingly different for the concept of totalitarianism to explain very much in this area. In the end, it is more useful as a description than as an explanation, and it is probably better at helping us to understand how 20th century dictatorships behaved once they had achieved power than at accounting for how they got there. To be sure, there were some similarities between Russia and Germany before the First World War. Both nations were ruled by authoritarian monarchies, backed by a powerful bureaucracy and a strong military elite, confronting rapid social change brought about by industrialization. Both these political systems were destroyed by the profound crisis of defeat in the First World War, and both were succeeded by a brief period of conflict-ridden democracy before the conflicts were resolved by the advent of dictatorships. But there were also many crucial differences, principal among them the fact that the Bolsheviks completely failed to win the level of mass public support in free elections, which provided the essential basis for the Nazis coming to power. Russia was backward, overwhelmingly peasant, lacking in the basic functions of a civil society and a representative political tradition. It was a dramatically different country from the advanced and highly educated industrial Germany, with its long-nurtured traditions of representative institutions, the rule of law, and a politically active citizenry. It is certainly true that the First World War destroyed the old order all over Europe, but the old order differed substantially from one country to another, and it was destroyed in differing ways with differing consequences. If we are looking for another country with comparable developments, then, as we shall see, Italy, 19th century Europe's other newly unified nation alongside Germany, is a much better place to start than Russia. Searching for an explanation of the origins and rise of Nazism in German history undeniably runs the risk of making the whole process seem inevitable. At almost every turn, however, things might have been different. The triumph of Nazism was far from a foregone conclusion right up to the early months of 1933. Yet, it was no historical accident either. Hold on. Those who argued that Nazism came to power as part of an essentially European or Europe-wide set of developments are right to have done so up to a point. But they have paid far too little attention to the fact that Nazism, while far from being the unavoidable outcome of the course of German history, certainly did draw from its success on political and ideological traditions and developments that were specifically German in their nature. These traditions may not have gone back as far as Martin Luther, but they could certainly be traced back to the way German history developed in the course of the 19th century, and above all, to the process by which the country was turned into a unified state under Bismarck in 1871. It makes sense to start at this point, therefore, as Friedrich Minneke did in his reflections of 1946, when searching for the reasons why the Nazis came to power little over 6 decades later and wrought such havoc on Germany, Europe, and the world with so little opposition from the majority of Germans. As we shall see in the course of this book and the 2 succeeding volumes, there are many different answers to these questions, ranging from the nature of the crisis that overtook Germany in the early 1930s to the way in which the Nazis established and consolidated their rule once they had achieved power, and weighing them all up against each other is no easy task. Yet the burden of German history undeniably played a role, and it is with German history that this book, therefore, has to begin. Okay. Section 3 of the preface. The early 21st century is a particularly good moment for undertaking a project of this kind. Historical research on the Third Reich has gone through 3 major phases since 1945. In the first, from the end of the war to the middle of the 1960s, there was a heavy concentration on answering the questions addressed primarily in the present volume. Political scientists and historians, such as Karl Dietrich Brasher, have produced major works on the collapse of the Weimar Republic and the Nazi seizure of power. In the 1970s and 1980s, the focus shifted to the history of the years 1933 to 1939, the subject of the second volume of this study, aided by the return of vast quantities of captured documents from Allied custody to the German archives. In particular, Martin Brozat and Hans Mommsen produced a series of path-breaking studies of the internal structures of the Third Reich, arguing against the prevailing view that it was a totalitarian system in which decisions made at the top by Hitler were implemented all the way down, and examining the complex of competing power centers whose rivalry, they argued, drove the regime on to adopt steadily more radical policies. Their work was complemented by a massive new research into the history of everyday life under the Nazis, concentrating in particular on the years up to the outbreak of the Second World War. Since the 1990s, research has entered a third phase in which there has been a particular focus on the years 1939 to 1945, the subject of the third volume of this study. The discovery of new documents in the archives of the former Soviet bloc, the increasing public prominence given to the persecution and extermination of the Jews and others, from homosexuals to asocials, from slave laborers to the handicapped by the Nazis, have all generated a large quantity of important new knowledge. The time seems right, therefore, to attempt a synthesis that brings the results of these three phases of research together and to take advantage of the great quantity of new material from the diaries of Joseph Goebbels, I don't know how to pronounce your cringe letters, and Victor Klemperer, to the records of the meetings of the German cabinet and the appointments book of Heinrich Himmler that has become available recently. For any historian, a task such as this is a bold, if not rash or even foolhardy undertaking, doubly so for a historian who is not German. However, I have been thinking about the historical questions dealt with in this book for many years. My interest in German history was first seriously awakened by Fritz Fischer, whose visit to Oxford during my time there as an undergraduate was a moment of major intellectual significance. Later, in Hamburg, researching for my doctorate, I was able to share a little of the extraordinary excitement generated by Fischer and his team, whose opening up of the question of continuity in modern German history created a real sense of ferment, even crusade, among the younger German historians whom he gathered around him. At that time, in the early 1970s, I was interested mainly in the origins of the Third Reich, in the Weimar Republic, and the Wilhelmine Empire, or is it Wilhelmine Empire? Only later did I come to write about the ways in which Nazi Germany aroused heated controversy amongst modern German historians, and to do some archival research on the period 1933 to 1945 myself as part of a larger project on the death penalty in modern German history. Over these years, I was lucky enough to be helped in many ways by a whole range of German friends and colleagues, notably Jürgen Koka, Wolfgang Mommsen, Volker Ulrich, these are troll names, bro, and Hans Ulrich Wehler. Numerous, often lengthy stays in Germany generously funded by institutions such as USAID. What? I'm just kidding, sorry. Numerous, often lengthy stays in Germany generously funded by institutions such as the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and the German Academic Exchange Service helped educate me, I hope, into a better understanding of German history and culture than I set out with at the beginnings of the 1970s. Few countries could have been more generous or more open to outsiders wishing to study their problematic and uncomfortable past. And the community of specialists on German history in Britain has been a constant support throughout. Early on, during my time at Oxford, Tim Mason was a particular source of inspiration, and Anthony Nichols guided my researches with a sure hand. Of course, none of this, in the end, can ever compensate for the fact that I am not a native German, but perhaps the distance that is inevitably the result of being a foreigner can also lend a certain detachment, or at least a difference of perspective that may go some way to balancing out this obvious disadvantage. Although I had written about the origins, consequences, and historiography of the Third Reich, researched part of its history in the archives, and taught a slowly evolving, document-based course on it to undergraduates over a period of more than 20 years, it was not until the 1990s that I was prompted to devote my attention to its full time. I shall always be grateful, therefore, to Anthony Julius for asking me to act as an expert witness in the libel case brought by David Irving against Deborah Lipstadt and her publishers, and to the whole defense team, and most especially leading counsel Richard Rampton, QC, and my research assistants, Nick Vossman and Thomas Skelton Robinson, for many hours of fruitful and provocative discussion on many aspects of the history of the Third Reich that surfaced during the case. This is that book that I referenced, the Lying About Hitler one, for the case that he was involved in. It was a privilege to be involved in a case whose importance turned out to be greater than any of us expected. Apart from this, one of the many major surprises of the work we did on the case was the discovery that many aspects of the subjects we were dealing with were still surprisingly ill documented. Another, just as important, was that there was really no wide-ranging, detailed overall account of the broader historical context of Nazi policies towards the Jews in the general history of the Third Reich itself, despite the existence of many excellent accounts of those policies in a narrower framework. This sense of the growing fragmentation of knowledge on Nazi Germany was strengthened when I was asked soon afterwards to sit on the British government's spoliation advisory panel, considering claims for the restitution of cultural objects alienated unjustly from their original owners in the years from 1933 to 1945. Here was another area where answering specialized questions sometimes depended on historical knowledge of the wider context, yet there was no general history of Nazi Germany to which I could direct the other members of the panel to help them in this regard. At the same time, my direct confrontation with these important legal and moral dimensions of the Nazi experience through working in these two very different contexts convinced me more than ever of the need for a history of the Third Reich that did not take moral or legal judgment as its frame of reference. These, then, are some of the reasons why I have written this book. They may help to explain some of its distinctive features. To begin with, in a history such as this, directed to a wide readership, it is important to avoid technical terms. Since this is a book for English language speakers, I have translated German terms into the English equivalent in almost every instance. Retaining the German is a form of mystification or even romanticization, which ought to be avoided. There are only 3 exceptions. The first is Reich, which, as Chapter 1 explains, had particular, untranslatable resonances in German far beyond its English equivalent of empire, with its associated term Reichstag, right, referring to the German national parliament. This is a word which ought to be familiar to every English-speaking reader, and it would be artificial to speak, for example, of the Third Empire instead of the Third Reich, or the Parliament fire instead of the Reichstag fire. The title Kaiser has also been retained in preference to the rough English equivalent of emperor because it, too, awakened specific and powerful historical memories. Some other German words or terms associated with the Third Reich have also gained currency in English, but in doing so, they have become divorced from their original meaning. Gauleiter, for instance, just means a Nazi tyrant, so to give it a more precise meaning, I have translated it everywhere as a regional leader. Similarly, Hitler is referred to throughout not as Führer or Führer, but as the equivalent of the term leader. And although everyone is familiar with the title of Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, few probably know that it means my struggle unless they know German. One of the purposes of translation is to allow English-speaking readers to gain a feeling for what these things actually meant. They were not mere titles or words, but carried a heavy ideological baggage with them. Okay, I'm reading another chapter today. Good luck. Is it wrong to begin with Bismarck? On several levels, he was a key figure in the coming of the Third Reich. For one thing, the cult of his memory in the years after his death encouraged many Germans to long for the return of the strong leadership his name represented. For another, his actions and policies in the mid to late 19th century helped create an ominous legacy for the German future. Yet in many ways, he was a complex and contradictory figure, as much European as German, as much modern as traditional. Here, too, his example pointed forwards to the tangled mixture of the new and the old that was so characteristic of the Third Reich. It is worth calling to mind that a mere 50 years separated Bismarck's foundation of the German Empire in 1871 from the electoral triumphs of the Nazis in 1930 to 1932. That there was a connection between the two seems impossible to deny. It was here, rather than in the remote religious cultures and hierarchical polities of the Reformation or the enlightened absolutism of the 18th century, that we find the first real moment in German history which it is possible to relate directly to the coming of the Third Reich in 1933. just like to highlight shit to make myself feel like I'm so intelligent. Born in 1815, Otto von Bismarck made his reputation. It's Bismarck, not Bismarck, right? It's Bismarck? I think it's Bismarck. Born in 1815, Otto von Bismarck made his reputation as the wild man of German conservatism, given to brutal statements and violent actions, never afraid to state with forceful clarity what more cautious spirits were afraid to say out loud. Coming from a traditional, aristocratic background, rooted both in the Junker land-owning class and the civil service nobility, he seemed, to many, to represent Prussianism in an extreme form, with all its virtues and vices. His domination over German politics in the second half of the 19th century was brutal, arrogant, and complete. He could not conceal his contempt for liberalism, socialism, parliamentarism, egalitarianism, and many other aspects of the modern world. Yet this seemed to do no harm to the almost mythical reputation he acquired after his death as the creator of the German Empire. On the centenary of his birth in 1915, when Germany was in the midst of fighting the First World War, a humane liberal, such as the historian Friedrich Minneke, something like that, could take comfort, even inspiration, from the image of the Iron Chancellor as a man of force and power. It is the spirit of Bismarck, he wrote, which forbids us to sacrifice our vital interests and has forced us to the heroic decision to take up the prodigious struggle against East and West, to speak with Bismarck like a strong fellow who has two good fists at his disposal, one for each opponent. Here was the great and decisive leader whose lack many Germans felt acutely at this crucial juncture in their history's fortunes. They were to feel the absence of such a leader even more acutely in the years after the war ended. Yet, in reality, Bismarck was a far more complex character than this crude image fostered by his acolytes after his death. He was not the reckless, risk-taking gambler of later legend. Too few Germans subsequently remembered that it was Bismarck who was responsible for defining politics as the art of the possible. He always insisted that his technique was to calculate the way events were going, then take advantage of them for his own purposes. He himself put it more poetically: a statesman cannot create anything for himself. He must wait and listen until he hears the steps of God sounding through events. Then leap up and grasp at the hem of his garment. What a great quote. Wow, this Bismarck guy seems pretty cool. Hope he doesn't do anything bad later on. Wait, I think just ordinary notes. I think I usually do in orange. Bismarck knew that he could not force events into any pattern that he wanted. If, then, to adopt another of his favorite metaphors, the art of politics consisted in navigating the ship of state along the stream of time, in what direction was that stream flowing in 19th century Germany? For more than a millennium before the century began, Central Europe had been splintered into myriad autonomous states, some of them powerful and well-organized, like Saxony and Bavaria, and others small or medium-sized free cities or tiny principalities and knighthoods which consisted of little more than a castle and a modestly sized estate. These were all gathered together in the so-called Holy Roman Reich of the German nation, founded by Charlemagne in 800 and dissolved by Napoleon in 1806. This was the famous Thousand-Year Reich, which it ultimately became the Nazis' ambition to emulate. By the time it collapsed under the weight of Napoleon's invasions, the Reich was in a parlous condition. Attempts to establish a meaningful degree of central authority had failed, and powerful and ambitious member states, such as Austria and Prussia, had tended increasingly to throw their weight around as if the Reich did not exist. When the dust settled after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the European states set up a successor organization to the Reich in the form of the German Confederation, whose borders were roughly the same and included, as before, the German and Czech-speaking parts of Austria. For a while, the police system established across Central Europe by the Austrian Chancellor Prince Metternich successfully kept the lid on the boiling cauldron of liberal and revolutionary activity stirred up amongst an active minority of educated people before 1815 by the French. Yet, By the middle of the 1840s, a new generation of intellectuals, lawyers, students, and local politicians had grown dissatisfied with the situation. They came to believe that the quickest way to rid Germany of its many great and petty tyrannies was to sweep away the individual member states of the Confederation and replace them with a single German polity founded on representative institutions and guaranteeing the elementary rights and freedoms of speech, freedom of the press, and so on, which were still denied in so many parts of Germany. Popular discontent generated by the poverty and starvation of the hungry 40s gave them their chance. In 1848, revolution broke out in Paris and flashed across Europe. Existing German governments were swept away and the liberals came to power. The revolutionaries quickly organized elections in the Confederation, including Austria, and a national parliament duly assembled at Frankfurt. After much deliberation, the deputies voted through a list of fundamental rights and established a German constitution along classic liberal lines. But they were unable to gain control over the armies of the two leading states, Austria and Prussia. This proved decisive. By the autumn of 1848, the monarchs and generals of the two states had recovered their nerve. They refused to accept the new constitution, and, after a wave of radical democratic revolutionary activity swept across Germany the following spring, they forcibly dissolved the Frankfurt Parliament and sent its deputies home. The revolution was over. The Confederation was reestablished, and the leading revolutionaries were arrested, imprisoned, or forced into exile. The following decade has been widely seen by historians as a period of deep reaction, when liberal values and civic freedoms were crushed under the iron heel of German authoritarianism. Many historians have regarded the defeat of the 1848 revolution as a crucial event in modern German history. The moment, in the historian A.G.P. Taylor's famous phrase, when German history reached its turning point and failed to turn. Yet Germany did not embark upon a straight or undeviating special path towards aggressive nationalism and political dictatorship after 1848. There were to be many avoidable twists and turns along the way. Sure. To begin with, the fortunes of the liberals had undergone a dramatic transformation once more by the beginning of the 1860s. Far from being a complete return to the old order, the post-revolutionary settlement had sought to appease many of the liberals' demands while stopping short of granting either national unification or parliamentary sovereignty. Trial by jury in open court, equality before the law, freedom of business enterprise, abolition of the most objectionable forms of state censorship of literature and the press, the right of assembly and association, and much more were in place almost everywhere in Germany by the end of the 1860s. And, crucially, many states had instituted representative assemblies in which elected deputies had freedom of debate and enjoyed at least some rights over legislation and the raising of state revenues. It was precisely the last right that the resurgent liberals used in Prussia in 1862 to block the raising of taxes until the army was brought under the control of the legislature, as it had fatally not been in 1848. This posed a serious threat of the legislature as it had This posed a serious threat to the funding of the Prussian military machine. In order to deal with the crisis, the Prussian king appointed the man who has become the dominant figure in German politics for the next 30 years, Otto von Bismarck. By this time, the liberals had correctly decided that there was no chance of Germany uniting, as in 1848, in a nation-state that included German-speaking Austria. That would have meant the breakup of the Habsburg monarchy, which included huge swaths of territory from Hungary to northern Italy that lay outside the boundaries of the German Confederation and included many millions of people who spoke languages other than German. But the liberals also considered that following the unification of Italy in 1859-1860, their time had come. If the Italians had managed to create their own nation-state, then surely the Germans would be able to do so as well. Bismarck belonged to a generation of European politicians like Benjamin Disraeli in Britain, Napoleon III in France, or Camillo Cavour in Italy, who were prepared to use radical, even revolutionary means to achieve fundamentally conservative ends. He recognized that the forces of nationalism were not to be gainsaid, but he also saw that after the frustrations of 1848, many liberals would be prepared to sacrifice at least some of their liberal principles on the altar of national unity to get what they wanted. In a series of swift and ruthless moves, Bismarck allied with the Austrians to seize the disputed duchies of Schleswig-Holstein from the Kingdom of Denmark, then engineered a war over their administration between Prussia and Austria, which ended in complete victory for the Prussian forces. The German Confederation collapsed, to be followed by the creation of a successor institution without the Austrians or their South German allies, named by Bismarck, for want of a more imaginative term, the North German Confederation. Immediately, the majority of the Prussian liberals, sensing that the establishment of a nation-state was just around the corner, forgave Bismarck for his policy, pursued with sublime disdain for parliamentary rights over the previous 4 years, of collecting taxes and funding the army without parliamentary approval. Okay. They cheered him on as he engineered another war with the French, who rightly feared that the creation of a united Germany would spell the end of the predominance in European power politics, which they had enjoyed over the past decade and a half. The crushing of the French armies at Sedan and elsewhere was followed by the proclamation of a new German empire in the Hall of Mirrors at the former French royal palace of Versailles. Built by Louis XIV, the Sun King. It's Louis, or is it Louis XIV? Louis XIV? King Louis? King Louis? I'm going to say silent S, Louis. Built by Louis XIV, the Sun King, at the height of his power nearly 200 years before, the palace was now turned into a humiliating symbol of French impotence and defeat. This was a key moment in modern German and indeed European history. To liberals, it seemed the fulfillment of their dreams, but there was a heavy price for them to pay. Several features of Bismarck's creation had ominous consequences for the future. First of all, the decision to call the new state the German Reich inevitably conjured up memories of its 1,000-year predecessor, the dominant power in Europe for so many centuries. Some indeed referred to Bismarck's creation as the Second Reich. The use of the word implied, too, that where the First Reich had failed in the face of French aggression, the Second had succeeded. Among the many aspects of his creation that survived the fall of Bismarck's German Reich in 1918, the continued use of the term German Empire, Deutsches Reich, by the Weimar Republic and all its institutions was far from being the least significant. The word Reich conjured up an image among educated Germans that resonated far beyond the institutional structures Bismarck created. The successor to the Roman Empire, the vision of God's empire here on earth, the universality of its claim to suzerainty? I don't know what that word means. Hold on. What the fuck? Deutsches Reich. How do you pronounce that? Wait. The right of a country to partly control another. Okay.
Suzerainty.
Suzerainty. The universality of its claim to suzerainty, in a more prosaic but no less powerful sense, the concept of a German state that would include all German speakers in Central Europe. One people, one Reich, one leader, as the Nazi slogan was to put it. There always remained those in Germany who thought the Bismarck's creation only a partial realization of the idea of a true German Reich. Initially, their voices were drowned by the euphoria of victory, but with time, their number was to grow. The constitution which Bismarck devised for the new German Reich in 1871 in many ways fell far short of the ideals dreamed of by the liberals in 1848. Alone of all modern German constitutions, it lacked any declaration of principle about human rights and civic freedoms. Formally speaking, the new Reich was a loose confederation of independent states, much like its predecessor had been. Its titular head was the Emperor or Kaiser, the title taken over from the old head of the Holy Roman Reich and ultimately deriving from the Latin name Caesar. He had wide-ranging powers, including the declaration of war and peace. The Reich's institutions were stronger than those of the old, with a nationally elected parliament, the Reichstag. The name, deriving from the Holy Roman Reich, was another survival across the revolutionary divide of 1918, and a number of central administrative institutions, most notably the Foreign Office, to which more were added as time went on. But the Constitution did not accord to the national parliament the power to elect or dismiss governments and their ministers, and key aspects of political decision-making, above all on matters of war and peace, and on the administration of the army, were reserved to the monarch and his immediate entourage. Interesting. Okay. So there's a parliament made, but in a way, the monarch retains a lot of the power to control the parliament itself. And then obviously there's a lot of powers reserved to the monarch. Okay. Government ministers, including the head of the civilian administration, the Reich Chancellor, an office created by Bismarck and held by him for some 20 years, were civil servants, not party politicians, and they were beholden to the Kaiser and not to the people or to their parliamentary representatives. With time, the influence of the Reichstag grew, though not by very much. With only mild exaggeration, the great revolutionary thinker Karl Marx described the Bismarckian Reich in a convoluted phrase that captured many of its internal contradictions as a bureaucratically constructed military despotism dressed up with parliamentary forms, mixed in with an element of feudalism, yet at the same time already influenced by the bourgeois. Nice. The power of the military, and in particular of the Prussian officer corps, was not simply the product of times of war. It derived from a long historical tradition. Wait, hold on. I don't know fuck all about German history. So was, wait. Wait, so when he says he made himself the Reich Chancellor, the head of the German administration, was Otto von Bismarck also the Kaiser, the emperor, the bullshit or whatever? Is that what he was as well? He was both? When they say that he made himself no, he was not the Kaiser. Wait, so what was his role in all this? Or do we have this? Did it say that? Did I miss this? He's just the prime minister, basically. Okay. Prime minister is the head of the... Chancellor, is that the head of the parliament, or is that underneath the Kaiser? He was the Kaiser's number one guy who did everything for him. Okay. Gotcha. Chancellor is just prime minister. Destiny, that's what happens when you skip World War I. Oh, shit, my bad. Because World War I would have explained what was going on here in the 1800s. Thank you. Sanika in YouTube chat. Thank you so much. What was I thinking? Okay. The power of the military, and in particular of the Prussian officer corps, was not simply the product of times of war. It derived from a long historical tradition. The 17th and 18th centuries, the expanding Prussian state had organized itself along largely military lines, with the neo-feudal system of landowners, the famous Junkers, and serfs intermeshing neatly with the military recruiting system for officers and men. This system was dismantled with the ending of serfdom, and the traditional prestige of the army was badly dented by a series of crushing defeats in the Napoleonic Wars. In 1848 and again in 1862, Prussian liberals came close to bringing the military under parliamentary control. It was above all in order to protect the autonomy of the Prussian officer corps from liberal interference that Bismarck was appointed in 1862. He immediately announced that the great questions of the day are not decided by speeches and majority resolutions. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood. He was as good as his word. The War of 1866 destroyed the Kingdom of Hanover, incorporating it into Prussia, and expelled Austria and Bohemia from Germany after centuries in which they had played a major part in shaping its destinies, while the War of 1870 to 1871 took away Alsace-Lorraine from France and placed it under the direct suzerainty, the German Empire. It is with some justification that Bismarck has been described as a white revolutionary. Military force and military action created the Reich, and in doing so, they swept aside legitimate institutions, redrew state boundaries, and overthrew long-established traditions with a radicalism and a ruthlessness that cast a long shadow over the subsequent development of Germany. Sure. Everybody else highlights it. I mean, I have to, right? I don't want to be a fucking retard. Jesus. They also thereby legitimized the use of force for political ends to a degree well beyond what was common in most other countries, except when they contemplated imperial conquests in other parts of the world. Militarism in state and society was to play an important part in undermining German democracy in the 1920s and in the coming of the Third Reich. Okay, true. I hate that when they show you what other people underline, because I feel like I have to, right? Oh, Junker is pronounced Junker? Junker? Is that true? Because I feel like I have to highlight. I don't want to be a retard that stands against all the other highlighters, bro. Damn. When do we get to the part where Churchill's the bad guy? That's what I want to know. That's the only reason I'm reading this slop. Bismarck saw to it that the army was virtually a state within a state, with its own immediate access to the Kaiser and its own system of self-government. The Reichstag only had the right to approve its budget every 7 years, and the Minister of War was responsible to the army rather than to the legislature. Officers enjoyed many social and other privileges and expected the deference of civilians when they met on the street. Not surprisingly, it was the ambition of many a bourgeois professional to be admitted as an officer in the Army Reserve, while, for the masses, compulsory military service produced familiarity with military codes of conduct and military ideals and values. In times of emergency, the Army was entitled to establish martial law and suspend civil liberties, a move considered so frequently during the Wilhelmine period that some historians have, with pardonable exaggeration, described the politicians and legislators of the time as living under the permanent threat of a coup d'etat from above. The army impacted on society in a variety of ways, most intensively of all in Prussia, then, after 1871 more indirectly, through the Prussian example in other German states as well. Its prestige, gained in the stunning victories of the wars of unification, was enormous. Non-commissioned officers, that is, those men who stayed on after their term of compulsory military service was over and served in the army for a number of years, had an automatic right to a job in state employment when they finally left the army. This meant that the vast majority of policemen, postmen, railwaymen, and other lower servants of the state were ex-soldiers who had been socialized in the army and behaved in the military fashion to which they had become accustomed. The rule book of an institution like the police force, concentrated on enforcing military models of behavior, insisted that the public be kept at arm's length, and ensured that, in street marches and mass demonstrations, the crowd would be more likely to be treated like an enemy force than an assembly of citizens. Military concepts of honor were pervasive enough to ensure the continued vitality of dueling among civilian men, even amongst the middle classes, though it was also common in Russia and France as well. Okay, wait. So this new Kaiser Third Reich or Second Reich bullshit, what was the name of this? The new German Reich in 1871. Is that what it was called? Just the German Reich? The German Empire. And that started in 1871? Yeah, I was there. Okay. Whoa, maps. Cool. Abbreviations refer to small parts of states whose names also feature on the map in full. Wow. Unbelievable. Wow. Wait, what? I don't understand what part of this map. Is this Northern Africa? Is that the Mediterranean up? Over time, the identification of the officer corps with the Prussian aristocracy weakened, and aristocratic military codes were augmented by new forms of popular militarism, including in the early 1900s the Navy League and the Veterans Clubs. By the time of the First World War, most of the key positions in the officer corps were held by professionals, and the aristocracy was dominant mainly in traditional areas of social prestige and snobbery, such as the cavalry and the guards, much as it was in other countries. But the professionalization of the officer corps, hastened by the advent of new military technology from the machine gun and barbed wire to the aeroplane and the tank, did not make it any more democratic. On the contrary, military arrogance was strengthened by the colonial experience when German armed forces ruthlessly put down rebellions of indigenous peoples, such as the Hereros in German Southwest Africa, now Namibia. That's really far away. In 1904 to 1907, in an act of deliberate genocide, the German army massacred thousands of Herero, am I pronouncing this right? Herero men, women, and children, and drove many more of them into the desert where they starved. From a population of some 80,000 before the war, the Hereros declined to a mere 15,000 by 1911 as a result of these actions. An occupied part of the German Empire, such as Alsace-Lorraine, annexed from France in 1871. What is this territory, Alsace-Lorraine? Is that like part of France today or part of Italy, or where the fuck is this? Hold on. Oh, I see it. Who owns that today? That's in France today? All of it or just part of it? Or it's Alsace? Alsace? It's where France meets Germany. Okay. In an occupied part of the German Empire, such as Alsace-Lorraine, annexed from France in 1871, the army frequently behaved like conquerors, facing a hostile and refractory population. Some of the most flagrant examples of such behavior had given rise in 1913 to a heated debate in the Reichstag in which the deputies passed a vote of no confidence in the government. This did not, of course, force the government to resign, but it illustrated, nonetheless, the growing polarization of opinion over the role of the army in German society. The extent to which Bismarck managed to control the army's wilder impulses and restrain its desire for massive territorial annexations in the wake of its military victories was not realized by many at the time. Indeed, particularly after his enforced resignation in 1890, the myth emerged, encouraged not least by the disgruntled ex-chancellor and his followers, of Bismarck himself as a charismatic leader who had ruthlessly cut the Gordian knots of politics and solved the great questions of the day by force. It was Bismarck's revolutionary wars in the 1860s that remained in the German public memory, not the two subsequent decades in which he tried to maintain the peace in Europe in order to allow the German Reich to find its feet. As the diplomat Ulrich von Hassel, a leader of the conservative resistance to Hitler in 1944, confided to his diary during a visit to Bismarck's old residence in Friedrichstraße. Fuck you, dude. It is regrettable how false is the picture which we ourselves have created of him in the world as the jackbooted politician of violence and childish pleasure at the fact that someone finally brought Germany to a position of influence again. In truth, his great gift was for the highest diplomacy and moderation. He understood uniquely how to win the world's trust, the exact opposite of today. Wow. Go to the next. Fuck. The myth of the dictatorial leader was not the expression of an ancient, ingrained aspect of the German character. It was a much more recent creation. It was fueled in the early 20th century by the public memory of Bismarck's tough stance against those whom he regarded as the internal enemies of the Reich. In the 1870s, reacting against the Pope's attempts to strengthen his hold over the Catholic community through the syllabus of errors and the declaration of papal infallibility, Bismarck inaugurated what liberals dubbed the struggle for culture, a series of laws and police measures which aimed to bring the Catholic Church under the control of the Prussian state. The Catholic clergy refused to cooperate with laws requiring them to undergo training at state institutions and submit clerical appointments to state approval. Before long, those who contravened the new laws were being hounded by the police, arrested, and sent to gaol. What is that, like a prison or jail? Or the fuck does that mean? Jail.
Jail.
Well, read it in the... Gaol is jail in France. Okay. Wait, is it pronounced jail? And he just types... It's pronounced... Oh, it's jail. Oh, okay. This guy's just a Brit bonger. Fuck this guy. Okay. Bonger. By the mid-1870s, 989 parishes were without incumbents, 225 priests were in jail, all Catholic religious orders, apart from those involved in nursing, had been suppressed, 2 archbishops and 3 bishops had been removed from office, and the Bishop of Trier had died shortly after his release from 9 months in prison. What was even more disturbing was that this massive assault on the civil liberties of some 40% of the population of the Reich was cheered on by Germany's liberals, who regarded Catholicism as so serious a threat to civilization that it justified extreme measures such as these. The struggle eventually died down, leaving the Catholic community an embittered enemy of liberalism and modernity and determined to prove its loyalty to the state, not least through the political party it had formed in order, initially, to defend itself against persecution, the so-called Center Party. But before this process was even complete, Bismarck struck another blow against civil liberties with the anti-socialist law, passed by the Reichstag after 2 assassination attempts on the aged Kaiser Wilhelm. Is it Wilhelm or is it Wilhelm? How do they say this? On the aged Kaiser Wilhelm I in 1878. In fact, Germany's fledgling socialist movement had nothing to do with the would-be assassins and was a law-abiding organization, putting its trust in the parliamentary route to power. Once more, however, the liberals were persuaded to abandon their liberal principles and what was presented to them as the national interest. Socialist meetings were banned, socialist newspapers and magazines suppressed, the Socialist Party outlawed. Capital punishment, previously in abeyance in Prussia and every other major German state, was reintroduced. Mass arrests and widespread imprisonment of socialists followed. The consequences of the anti-socialist law were, if anything, even more far-reaching than those of the struggle with the Catholic Church. It, too, completely failed in its immediate aim of suppressing supposed enemies of the Reich. The socialists could not legally be banned from standing in parliamentary elections as individuals, and as Germany's industrialization gathered pace and the industrial working class increased ever more rapidly in numbers, so socialist candidates won an ever-growing share of the vote. After the law was allowed to lapse in 1890, the socialists reorganized themselves in the Social Democratic Party of Germany. By the eve of the First World War, the party had over 1 million members, the largest political organization anywhere in the world. That's cute. In the 1912 elections, despite an inbuilt bias of the electoral system in favor of conservative rural constituencies, it overtook the Center Party as the largest single party in the Reichstag. The regression of the anti-socialist law had driven it to the left, and from the beginning of the 1890s onwards, it adhered to a rigid Marxist creed, according to which the existing institutions of church, state, and society, from the monarchy and the army officer corps to big business and the stock market, would be overthrown in a proletarian revolution that would bring a socialist republic into being. The liberals' support for the anti-socialist law caused the Social Democrats to distrust all bourgeois political parties and to reject any idea of cooperating with the political supporters of capitalism or the exponents of what they regarded as a merely palliative reform to the existing political system. Palliative, I think, reform to the existing political system. Vast, highly disciplined, tolerating no dissent, and seemingly unstoppable in its forward march towards electoral dominance, the social democratic movement struck terror into the hearts of the respectable middle and upper classes. A deep gulf opened up between the social democrats on the one hand and all the bourgeois parties on the other. This unabridgeable political divide was to endure well into the 1920s and play a vital role in the crisis that eventually brought the Nazis to power. At the same time, however, the party was determined to do everything it could to remain within the law and not to provide any excuse for the oft-threatened reintroduction of a banning order. Lenin was once said to have remarked, in a rare flash of humor, that the German Social Democrats would never launch a successful revolution in Germany because when they came to storm the railway stations, they would line up in an orderly queue to buy platform tickets first. The party acquired the habit of waiting for things to happen rather than acting to bring them about. Its massively elaborate institutional structure with its cultural organizations, its newspapers and magazines, its pubs, its bars, its sporting clubs, and its educational apparatus came in time to provide a whole way of life for its members and to constitute a set of vested interests that few in the party were prepared to jeopardize. As a law-abiding institution, oh, that's cute, fuck it, why not? We love quotes here. As a law-abiding institution, the party put its faith in the courts to prevent persecution. Yet, remaining within the law was not easy, even after 1890. Petty chicanery by the police was backed up by conservative judges and prosecutors, and by courts that continued to regard the Social Democrats as dangerous revolutionaries. There were few Social Democratic speakers or party newspaper editors who had not by 1914 spent several terms of imprisonment after being convicted of lèse-majesté, or insulting state officials. Criticizing the monarch or the police, or even the civil servants who ran the country could still count as an offense under the law. Chicanery? Is it chicanery? Sorry. Sock dem meaning still capitalist back then? No, it sounds like these people were full-on Marxist. These social democrats were, the German social democrats at least in the 1800s, it sounds like were more Marxist. Or socialist at least. Where were we? Oh. Combating the Social Democrats became the business of a whole generation of judges, state prosecutors, police chiefs, and government officials before 1914. These men, and the majority of their middle and upper class supporters, never accepted the Social Democrats as a legitimate political movement. In their eyes, the law's purpose was to uphold the existing institutions of state and society, not to act as a neutral referee between opposing political groups, the deep state. The Liberals were certainly of no help in remedying the situation. They themselves lost heavily in terms of votes and seats in the Reichstag in the course of the 1880s and 1890s. Though they managed to retain a good deal of support in Germany's towns and cities, not the least of their problems was the fact that they had repeatedly split in the course of the late 19th century, and even after the more left-oriented groups had joined forces again in 1910, this still left two mainstream liberal parties, the National Liberals and the Progressives, whose differences went back to the refusal of the latter to forgive Bismarck for collecting taxes in Prussia without parliamentary authorization in the 1860s. Things were just as divided on the right of the political spectrum, however, where there was not one conservative party but two, since those who had supported Bismarck's merging of Prussian particularism into the institutions of the Reich in 1871, anathema to the die-hard Prussian nobility, the Junkers, maintained a separate identity as the so-called Free Conservatives. Moreover, these two largely Protestant North German parties had to contend with an even larger political party of the right, the Center, whose anti-modernism and support for the Reich were tempered by its advocacy of social welfare and its critical attitude towards German colonial rule in Africa. Thus, Germany before 1914 had not two mainstream political parties, but six: the Social Democrats, the two liberal parties, the two conservative groups of conservatives, and the Center Party, reflecting, among other things, the multiple divisions of German society by region, religion, and social class. In a situation where there was a strong executive, not directly responsible to the legislature, this weakened the prospect of party politics being able to play a determining role in the state. Where are we at? What time is it? We're good. Far from causing a general disillusion with politics, the competition of all these rival political parties helped heat up the political atmosphere until it reached positively feverish dimensions by 1914. Universal manhood suffrage in Reichstag elections, backed by a more or less secret ballot and strict rules of electoral propriety, gave voters confidence in the electoral system. Voter participation reached the astonishing figure of 85% of those eligible to cast their ballot in the Reichstag election of 1912. All the evidence goes to show that voters took their duty seriously and thought carefully about how to reconcile their ideological position within the broader political scenario when it came, as it often did, to voting a second time in runoff ballots under the system of proportional representation adopted by the German Constitution for elections to the Reichstag. The electoral system, guaranteed by legal provisions and safeguards, opened up a space for democratic debate and convinced millions of Germans of many political hues that politics belonged to the people. Moreover, the daily press in Imperial Germany was almost entirely political, with each newspaper explicitly tied to one or other of the various political parties and putting its point of view in almost everything it published. Politics were not just the staple diet of conversation amongst the elites and the middle classes, but formed a central focus of discussion in working-class pubs and bars, and even governed people's choice of leisure activities. Political discussion and debate turned increasingly, after the beginning of the 20th century, to the topic of Germany's place in Europe and the world. Germans were increasingly... Okay, never mind. Germans were increasingly aware of the fact that Bismarck's creation of the Reich was incomplete in a number of different ways. To begin with, it included substantial ethnic and cultural minorities, the legacy of previous centuries of state aggrandizement and ethnic aggrandizement, and ethnic conflict. There were Danes in the north, French speakers in Alsace-Lorraine, and a small Slavic group called the Sorbs in central Germany, but above all, there were millions of Poles inhabiting parts of the former Kingdom of Poland annexed by Prussia in the 18th century. Already under Bismarck, the state increasingly tried to Germanize these minorities, attacking the use of their languages in the schools and actively encouraging settlement by ethnic Germans. By the eve of the First World War, the use of German was mandatory in public meetings throughout the Reich, and land laws were being reformed in such a way as to deprive the Poles of their fundamental economic rights. The notion that ethnic minorities were entitled to be treated with the same respect as the majority population was a view held only by a tiny and diminishing minority of Germans. Even the Social Democrats thought of Russia and the Slavic East as lands of backwardness and barbarism by 1914, and had little or no sympathy for the efforts of Polish-speaking workers in Germany to organize in defense of their rights. Looking beyond Germany and Europe to the wider world, the Reich chancellors who came into office after Bismarck saw their country as a second-class nation when compared with Britain and France, both of which had major overseas empires that spanned the globe. A latecomer on the scene, Germany had only been able to pick up the scraps and crumbs left over by European colonial powers that had enjoyed a head start on them. Tanganyika, Namibia, Togoland, Cameroon, New Guinea, assorted Pacific islands, and the Chinese treaty port of Jiaozhou were virtually all the territories that made up Germany's overseas empire on the eve of the First World War. Bismarck had thought them of little importance and lent his assent to their acquisition with great reluctance. But his successors came to take a different view. Germany's prestige and standing in the world demanded, as Bernhard von Bülow, Foreign Secretary in the late 1890s, then Reich Chancellor until 1909, put it a place in the sun. A start was made on the construction of a massive battle fleet, whose long-term aim was to win colonial concessions from the British, lords of the world's largest overseas empire, by threatening, or even carrying out, the crippling or destruction of the main force of the British Navy in a titanic confrontation in the North Sea. These increasingly ambitious dreams of world power were articulated above all by Kaiser Wilhelm II himself, a bombastic, self-important, and extremely loquacious man who lost few opportunities to express his contempt for democracy and civil rights, his disdain for the opinions of others, and his belief in Germany's greatness. The Kaiser, like many of those who admired him, had grown up after Germany had been united. He had little awareness of the precarious and adventurous route by which Bismarck had achieved unification in 1871. Following the Prussian historians of his day, he thought of the whole process as historically preordained. He knew none of the nervous apprehension about Germany's future that had led Bismarck to adopt such a cautious foreign policy in the 1870s and 1880s. Admittedly, the Kaiser's character was too erratic, his personality too mercurial, for him to have any really consistent effect on the conduct of state affairs, and all too often his ministers found themselves working to counter his influence rather than implement his wishes. His constant declarations that he was the great leader that Germany needed merely served to draw attention to his deficiencies in this respect and played their part, too, in fostering the nostalgic myth of Bismarckian decisiveness and guile. Many Germans came to contrast the ruthlessness of Bismarck's amoral statesmanship, in which the end justified the means, and statesmen could say one thing while doing or preparing to do another, with Wilhelm's impulsive bombast and ill-considered tactlessness. Personalities aside, all of these features of the Germany that Bismarck created could be observed to a greater or lesser degree in other countries as well. Wait, hold on. Sure. In Italy, the charismatic example of Garibaldi, Garibaldi, what a name, leader of the popular forces that helped unite the nation in 1859, provided a model for the later dictator Mussolini. In Spain, the army was no less free of political control than it was in Germany, and in Italy, as in Germany, it reported to the sovereign rather than to the legislature. In Austria-Hungary, the civil service was just as strong and parliamentary institutions even more limited in their power. In France, a church-state conflict raged. Something that is like kind of interesting, I guess, when I'm thinking about it. In the United States, I feel like the civil service and everything, we view them as like following the legislature and everything, or being part of the judiciary, but not being part of the executive, I would say, right? I guess unless you're talking about literally like police officers. I'm thinking in terms of like common law versus like civil law systems. I guess common law is a lot scarier when the judges and everything are part of civil service and they like kind of report to, or they make law based on what they would think the monarch would like, right? I guess that's how common law played out in these places. I would have to do more research on that one. Jesus. Okay. I don't know what that means. Don't worry about it. Suck my dick. Where was I at? In France, a church-state conflict raged that was not far behind that of the German struggle for culture and its ideological ferocity. In Russia, a concept equivalent to that of the Reich was also applied to domestic politics and Russia's relations with its nearest neighbors. The Tsarist regime in Russia repressed the socialists even more severely than did its German counterpart and did not yield an inch to the German authorities in its drive to assimilate the Poles, millions of whom were also under its sway. Liberalism, however defined, was weak in all the major states of Europe, of Eastern and Central Europe by 1914, not just in the German Reich. The political scene was still more fragmented in Italy than it was in Germany, and the belief that war was justified to achieve political aims, in particular the creation of a land empire, was common to many European powers, as the outbreak of the First World War was to show with such terrible clarity in August of 1914. All over the continent, the growing forces of democracy threatened the hegemony of conservative elites. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were the age of nationalism, not just in Germany, but everywhere in Europe, and the nationalization of the masses was taking place in many other countries as well. Yet, in no nation in Europe other than Germany were all these conditions present at the same time and to the same extent. Moreover, Germany was not just any European country. Much has been written by historians about various aspects of Germany's supposed backwardness at this time, its alleged deficit of civic values, its arguably antiquated social structure, its seemingly craven middle class, and its apparently neo-feudal aristocracy. This was not how most contemporaries saw it at the time. Well before the outbreak of the First World War, Germany was the continent's wealthiest, most powerful, and most advanced economy. In the last years of peace, Germany was producing 2/3 of continental Europe's output of steel, half its output of coal and lignite, and 20% more electrical energy than Britain, France, and Italy combined. By 1914, with a population of around 67 million, the German Empire commanded far greater resources of manpower than any other continental European power, with the exception of Russia. By comparison, the United Kingdom, France, and Austria-Hungary each had a population of between 40 and 50 million at this time. Germany was the world leader in the most modern industries, such as chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and electricity. In agriculture, the massive use of artificial fertilizers and farm machinery had transformed the efficiency of the landed estates of the north and east by 1914, by which time Germany was, for example, producing a third of the world's output of potatoes. Living standards had improved by leaps and bounds since the turn of the century, if not before. The products of Germany's great industrial firms, such as Krupps and Thyssen, Siemens and AEG, Hoechst and BASF, were famous for their quality the world over. Viewed nostalgically from the perspective of the early interwar years, Germany before 1914 seemed to many to have been a haven of peace, prosperity, and social harmony. Yet, beneath its prosperous and self-confident surface, it was nervous, uncertain, and racked by internal tensions. I'm sure why not. For many, the sheer pace of economic and social change was frightening and bewildering. Old values seemed to be disappearing in a welter of materialism and unbridled ambition. Modernist culture, from abstract painting to atonal music, added to the sense of disorientation in some areas of society. The old established hegemony of the Prussian landed aristocracy, which Bismarck had tried so hard to preserve, was undermined by the headlong rush of German society into the modern age. Bourgeois values, habits, and modes of behavior had triumphed in the upper and middle reaches of society by 1914, yet simultaneously they were themselves being challenged by the growing self-assertion of the industrial working class, organized in the massive social democratic labor movement. Germany, unlike any other European country, had become a nation-state not before the Industrial Revolution, but at its height, and on the basis not of a single state, but of a federation of many different states whose German citizens were bound together principally by a common language, culture, and ethnicity. Stresses and strains created by rapid industrialization interlocked with conflicting ideas about the nature of the German state and nation and their place in the larger context of Europe and the world. German society did not enter nationhood in 1871 in a wholly stable condition. It was riven by rapidly deepening internal conflicts, which were increasingly exported into the unresolved tensions of the political system that Bismarck had created. These tensions found release in an increasingly vociferous nationalism, mixed in with alarmingly strident doses of racism and anti-Semitism, which were to leave a baleful legacy for the future. How is this chapter 1? What the fuck chapter did we just read? The fuck? How many chapter 1s are there? Oh, it's all like section 1, I guess. Or whatever, bro. Wow, exciting. It's Arabic numerals, and they're Roman inside the Arabic. I'm the Roman inside your mom's Arabic, if you know what I mean. Okay, good luck. Towards the end of 1889, a Berlin primary school headmaster, Hermann Allwart, was facing the prospect of financial ruin. Born in 1846 into an impoverished family in Pomerania, he found the income he earned in his lowly position in the Prussian educational hierarchy too little to cover his considerable daily living expenses. In desperation, he committed a crime that seemed almost deliberately calculated to shock the sensibilities of his superiors. He he stole money from the funds collected to pay for the children's Christmas party at his school. Soon enough, his misdemeanor was discovered and he was dismissed from his post. This deprived him of his last remaining source of income. Many people would have been crushed by these disasters and overwhelmed by feelings of guilt and remorse, but not... No. No, I don't want to ever use Siri ever. No. Ever. It's pronounced Erman Allwart. But not Erman Allwart. Armin, or just Armin. Armin. I'm just going with Armin. The headmaster, as he soon came to be known by the general public, decided to go on to the offensive. Looking around for someone to blame for his misfortune, his attention quickly focused on the Jews. Germany's Jewish community at this time was a highly acculturated, successful group distinguished from other Germans mainly by its religion. In the course of the 19th century, civil disabilities attaching to non-Christians in the German states had gradually been removed, much as formal religious discrimination in other countries had been abolished. For example, in Britain, through Catholic emancipation in 1829, the last remaining legal impediments to full and equal legal rights were swept away with German unification in 1871. Now that civil marriage had been introduced in place of religious ceremonies all over Germany, the number of intermarriages between Jews and Christians began to grow rapidly. In Breslau, for instance, there were 35 Jewish Christian marriages for every 100 purely Jewish marriages by 1915, compared with only 9 in the late 1870s. Very few of the Christian partners in such marriages came from the families of converted Jews themselves, and the marriages were scattered right across the social scale. In 1904, 19% of Jewish men in Berlin and 13% of Jewish women married Christian partners. In Dusseldorf, a quarter of all Jews who married had Christian partners in the mid-1900s, rising to a third by 1914. By the eve of the First World War, there were 38 intermarriages for every 100 purely Jewish marriages. In Hamburg, the figure was as high as 73. Jews also began to convert to Christianity in growing numbers. 11,000 converted in the first 70 years of the 19th century, and 11,500 in the remaining 3 decades. Between 1880 and 1919, some 20,000 German Jews were baptized. Success was slowly dissolving the identity of the Jewish community as an enclosed religious group. The 600,000 or so practicing Jews who lived in the German Empire were a tiny religious minority in an overwhelmingly Christian society, constituting around 1% of the population as a whole. Excluded for centuries from traditional sources of wealth, such as landowning, they remained outside the ranks of the Reich's establishment as informal social discrimination continued to deny them a place in key institutions such as the army, the universities, and the top ranks of the civil service. Indeed, their access to such institutions actually declined in the 1890s and the 1900s. Converted Jews suffered sufficiently from everyday anti-Semitism for many of them to change their name to something more Christian-sounding. As many as 100,000 German Jews reacted to discrimination in the 19th century by emigrating, notably to the United States, but most stayed, particularly as the economy began to boom towards the end of the century. Those who remained were concentrated in the larger towns and cities, with a quarter of Germany's Jews living in Berlin by 1910 and nearly a third by 1933. Within these cities, they clustered into particular districts. Nearly half of Hamburg, is it Hamburg or Hamburg? It's Hamburg, right? Of Hamburg's Jews lived in the 2 middle-class precincts of Harvesthütte and Rotherbaum in 1885. Nearly 2/3 of Frankfurt's Jews in 4 of the city's 14 precincts in 1900. 70% of Berlin's Jews lived in 5 central and western districts, most of them overwhelmingly middle class by 1925. Even in the cities with the largest Jewish populations, Berlin, Breslau, and Frankfurt, they constituted a very tiny minority, making up no more than 4.3%, 6.4%, and 7.1% of the populations, respectively, in 1871. Many Jews found a place in business and the professions. Alongside the great banking family of the Rothschilds, there emerged many other important Jewish-owned finance houses, such as the banking firm of Blechroeder, to whom Bismarck entrusted his personal finances. New types of retailing, such as the department stores, of which there were about 200 in Germany before the First World War, often had Jewish owners, such as the Tietz family or the Wertheim brothers. Jewish men were particularly well represented in medicine, the law, science and research, university teaching, journalism, and the arts. The Jewish community was turning slowly from an ostracized religious minority into one ethnic group among many in an increasingly multicultural society. Alongside other minorities like Poles, Danes, Alsatians, Sorbs, and the rest. Like the other groups, it had its own increasingly secular representative institutions, notably the Central Association of German Citizens of the Jewish Faith, founded in 1893. Unlike most of the other groups, however, it was generally economically successful, and rather than having their own political party, its members tended to join and sometimes take leading positions in mainstream political parties, particularly on the left and in the center of the political spectrum. Most Jews identified strongly with German nationalism, and if the liberal parties were particularly attractive to them, this was not least because of their unequivocal support for the creation of a German nation-state. By and large, then, the Jewish story in the late 19th century was a success story, and Jews were associated above all with the most modern and progressive developments in society, culture, and the economy. It was developments such as these that made the Jews the target for disgruntled and unscrupulous agitators like Armin Allwert. For the disaffected and the unsuccessful, those who felt pushed aside by the juggernaut of industrialization and yearned for a simpler, more ordered, more secure, more hierarchical society such as they imagined had existed in the not-too-distant past, the Jews symbolized cultural, financial, and social modernity. Okay, if they highlighted it, I'll highlight it. Nowhere was this more the case than in Allwert's adopted city of Berlin. In 1873, the city's economy was dealt a hammer blow when the frantic round of spending and investing that had accompanied the euphoria of the Reich's foundation came to an abrupt end. A worldwide economic depression, sparked by the failure of railway investments in the United States, brought widespread bankruptcies and business failures in Germany. Small businesses and workshops were particularly badly hit. In their incomprehension of the wider forces that were destroying their livelihood, those most severely affected found it easy to believe the claims of Catholic and conservative journalists that Jewish financiers were to blame. As the Depression went on, the journalists were joined by the court preacher Adolf Stocker, a man of humble origin who embarked on a crusade to win back the working class from the influence of social democracy. Stocker founded a Christian social party that fought elections in the 1880s on an explicitly anti-Semitic platform. The new cause was aided by Max Liebermann von Sonnenberg, who helped organize a national petition for the removal of Jews from public positions in 1880. Particularly extreme was Ernst Heinrichi, whose rhetoric was so vehement that it caused riots in the Pomeranian town of Neustetten, culminating in the burning of the local synagogue. It was towards this movement that Armin Allwert gravitated in the late 1880s, avenging his disgrace with a book blaming his financial misfortunes on the machinations of Jewish moneylenders and suggesting that Jews were all-powerful in German society. Unfortunately for him, the evidence he provided for his claims, in the shape of documents showing the German government to be in the pay of the Jewish banker Gerson von Bleichroeder, turned out to have been written by Allwert himself, and he was sentenced to 4 months in prison. No sooner was he released than he produced another set of sensational and equally unfounded claims, this time declaring that a Jewish arms manufacturer had supplied the army with rifles that were deliberately faulty in order to further a Franco-Jewish conspiracy to undermine German military effectiveness. Predictably enough, these claims earned Allward another prison sentence, this time of 5 months. But he never served it, for in the meantime, he had succeeded in persuading the peasant farmers of a deeply rural constituency in Brandenburg to elect him to the Reichstag. Traveling round their farms, he told them that their misfortunes, brought on them, in fact, by a world depression in agricultural prices, had been caused by the Jews, a distant and to them obscure religious minority who lived far away in the big towns, financial centers of Europe and the Reich. A seat in the Reichstag gave Allward parliamentary immunity. His success testified to the appeal of such demagoguery to rural voters, and indeed other anti-Semites, such as the Hessian librarian Otto Burkel, I can't do that O thing. I'm going to say ER. Burkel succeeded in getting elected as well, not least by offering the peasants concrete measures such as cooperative organizations in order to get over their economic difficulties. By the early 1890s, the threat of such anti-Semites to the electoral hegemony of the German Conservative Party in rural districts was perceived to be so serious that the party itself, alarmed by a government policy that seemed likely to damage farming interests still further, voted onto its program a demand for the combating of the widely obtruding and decomposing Jewish influence on our popular life at its Tivoli conference in 1893. This proved in the end to be a turning point in the fortunes of Germany's motley collection of political anti-Semites. Although a serious attempt was made by another anti-Semitic agitator, Theodor Fritsch, to bring the various strands of political anti-Semitism together and direct the movement's appeal towards the economically discontented urban lower middle class, the egotism of figures like Buckle prevented any real union from taking place, and the anti-Semites were riven by internecine disputes. Jesus fucking Christ.
Internecine,
destructive to both sides in a conflict. Were riven by internecine disputes. Fritz's influence was to be exerted in another way. He continued to publish innumerable popular anti-Semitic tracts, which were widely read, right up to and beyond his death in September of 1933, by which time he was sitting in the Reichstag as a representative of the Nazi Party. Throughout the pre-war years, however, he remained a marginal political figure. By the early 1900s, the anti-Semites had been undermined by the effective coalition of the Berlin Christian Social Movement with the Conservative Party and stymied in Catholic areas by the willingness of the Center Party to engage in a similar kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric. Mavericks such as Buckle and Allward lost their seats and their parties, together with the urban-based organizations of anti-Semites such as Fritz, faded away into nothingness. Allward himself alienated even other anti-Semites with the violence of his language. He left for the United States for a while, and on his return devoted himself to combating the evils of Freemasonry. In 1909, he was in prison again, this time for blackmail. Evidently, his continuing financial difficulties had driven him to attempt even more directly criminal solutions than before. He finally died, somewhat anticlimactically, in a traffic accident in 1914. Allward was an extreme, but in some ways, not untypical representative of a new kind of anti-Semitism that was emerging in Germany and elsewhere in Europe towards the end of the 19th century. Traditional anti-Semitism focused on the non-Christian religion of the Jews and derived its political power from biblical sanction. The New Testament blamed the Jews for Christ's death, condemning them to perpetual obloquy. Obloquy. Strong public criticism. Condemning the Jews to perpetual obloquy by declaring that they had willingly agreed to let Christ's blood be upon them and their descendants. As a non-Christian minority in a society governed by Christian beliefs and Christian institutions, the Jews were obvious and easy targets for popular hatred in times of crisis, such as the Black Death in the mid-14th century, when rampaging mobs all over Europe blamed the Jews for the mortality that afflicted so many of the population, and took their revenge in countless acts of violence and destruction. It was no accident that the history of modern anti-Semitism in Germany began with the court preacher Adolf Stocker. Christian hostility to the Jews provided a crucial launchpad for modern anti-Semitism, not least because it often harbored a strong element of racial prejudice itself and was subsumed into racial anti-Semitism in a variety of ways. But by the late 19th century, it was becoming increasingly out of date, at least in its purest, most traditional form, particularly as the Jews were ceasing to be an easily identifiable religious minority and were beginning to convert and marry into Christian society at an increasing pace. Searching for a scapegoat for their economic difficulties in the 1870s, lower middle-class demagogues and scribblers turned to the Jews, not as a religious, but as a racial minority, and began to advocate for the total assimilation of Jews into German society, and began to advocate not the total assimilation of Jews into German society, but their total exclusion from it. The credit for this turn, if credit is the right word, is generally given to the obscure writer Wilhelm Marr, whose pamphlet, The Victory of Judaism over Germandom, viewed from a non-confessional standpoint, published in 1873, was the first to insist that, as he put it in his later work, there must be no question here of parading religious prejudices when it is a question of race and when the difference lies in the blood. Borrowing from the fashionable theories of the French racist Count Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, Marr contrasted Jews not with Christians, but with Germans, insisting that the two were distinct races. The Jews, he declared, had gained the upper hand in the racial struggle and were virtually running the country. No wonder, then, that honest German artisans and small businessmen were suffering. Marr went on to invent the word anti-Semitism and, in 1879, to found the League of Anti-Semites, the world's first organization with this in its title. Based. Racism. I invented the word racism. It was dedicated, as he said, to reducing the Jewish influence on German life. His writing struck an apocalyptically pessimistic note. In his testament, he proclaimed that the Jewish question is the axis around which the wheel of world history revolves, going on to record gloomily his view that all our social, commercial, and industrial development are built on a Jewish worldview. The roots of Marr's despair were personal as much as anything else. Constantly in financial difficulties, he was badly hit. Does this guy even explore the chance that maybe all these financial difficulties were intentionally caused? Right, honey? Don't you dare go back. I know what you're going to do. Stop. Chill. Calm the fuck down. The roots of Marr's despair were personal as much as anything else. Constantly in financial difficulties, he was badly hit by the financial troubles of the 1870s. His second wife, who was Jewish, supported him financially until her death in 1874. His third wife, whom he divorced after a brief and disastrous relationship, was half Jewish, and he blamed her in part for his lack of money, since he had to pay her substantial sums to bring up their child. Marr concluded from this, boldly elevating his personal experience into a general rule of world history, that racial purity was admirable, racial mixing a recipe for calamity. Given these very personal roots of his anti-Semitism, it's not surprising that Marr did not become closely involved in active politics. The League of Anti-Semites was a failure, and he refused to support the anti-Semitic parties because he considered them too conservative. But he was quickly joined as a propagandist of the new racial anti-Semitism by a range of other writers. The revolutionary Eugen Dühring, for example, equated capitalism with the Jews and argued that socialism had to be aimed chiefly at removing the Jews from financial and political influence. The nationalistic historian Heinrich von Treitschke argued that the Jews were undermining German culture and popularized the phrase, "the Jews are our misfortune," words that would become a slogan for many anti-Semites in the following years, including the Nazis. Writers such as these were far from marginal figures of the sort represented by Erman Allwart. Eugen Dühring, for example, exerted a sufficiently powerful attraction over the socialist movement for Friedrich Engels to pen his famous tract, the Anti-Dühring Fuck me, dude. In a successful attempt to combat its influence within the socialist labor movement in 1878. Heinrich von Treitschke's history was one of the most widely read of all German histories of the 19th century, and his diatribes against what he saw as Jewish materialism and dishonesty aroused a massive reaction amongst his fellow professors in Berlin, including the classicist Theodor Mommsen, the pathologist Rudolf Virchow, and the historian Gustav von Dreusen, who joined with many other German academics in condemning their colleagues' racial hatred and fanaticism in unequivocal terms. Such reactions were a reminder that for all the rapidly growing influence of anti-Semitic writers, the vast majority of respectable opinion in Germany, left and right, middle class and working class, remained opposed to racism of this kind. Attempts to get the German people to swallow anti-Semitic ideas whole met with little success. The German working class in particular, and its main political representative, the Social Democratic Party, the largest political organization in Germany, with more seats in the Reichstag than any other party after 1912, and the highest number of votes in national elections long before that, was resolutely opposed to anti-Semitism, which it regarded as backward and undemocratic. Even ordinary rank-and-file party members rejected its slogans of hatred, as one worker was heard to remark by a police agent listening out for political talk in the pubs and bars of Hamburg in 1898, national feeling must not degenerate into one nation setting itself above another. Worse still, if one regards the Jews as a subordinate race, and thus fights the race. Can the Jews help it if they descend from another lineage? They have always been an oppressed people, hence their scattering over the world. For the Social Democrat, it's self-evident that he wants the equality of everyone with a human spirit, the Jews not the worst by a long way. Other workers, on other occasions, were heard to pour scorn on the anti-Semites, condemn anti-Semitic violence, and support the Jewish desire for civil equality. Such views were entirely typical of workers in the labor movement milieu before 1914. The worst the Social Democrats could be accused of was not taking seriously enough the threat posed by anti-Semitism and of allowing a few anti-Semitic stereotypes to creep into a small number of cartoons printed in their entertainment magazines. In some areas, the Social Democrats and anti-Semites supported each other in electoral runoffs, but this did not imply approval of each other's principles, merely a desire to make temporary common cause as parties of protest against established elites. In a few backward small towns and villages, mainly in the deeply rural East, medieval accusations of ritual murder were occasionally brought against local Jews and won some popular support, even arousing protest demonstrations on occasion. Not one of them was ever proved by the courts. Small businessmen, shopkeepers, artisans, and peasant farmers were more inclined to overt anti-Semitism than most, continuing a tradition of organized popular anti-Semitism that can be traced back at least as far as the 1848 revolution in some areas, though not in its modern racist form. But among the educated middle class, non-Jewish businessmen and professionals, for the most part, worked quite happily with Jewish colleagues, whose representation in the liberal political parties was sufficiently strong to prevent them from taking on board any of the central arguments or attitudes of the anti-Semites. The anti-Semitic parties remained a fringe, protest phenomenon and largely disappeared shortly after the turn of the century. Nevertheless, their decline and fall was to some extent deceptive. One of the reasons for their disappearance lay in the adoption of anti-Semitic ideas by the mainstream parties whose constituents included the economically imperiled lower middle class groups to which the anti-Semites had originally appealed, the Conservatives and the Center Party. The Conservatives built on the anti-Semitic policies contained in their 1893 Tivoli program and continued to demand the reduction of what they thought of as the subversive influence of Jews in public life. Their anti-Semitic prejudices appealed to significant groups in Protestant rural society in North Germany and to the artisans, shopkeepers, and small businessmen represented in the party's Christian social wing. For the much larger, though under the Reich arguably less influential, Center Party, the Jews, or rather a distorted and polemical image of them, symbolized liberalism, socialism, modernity, all the things the church rejected. Such a view appealed to large numbers of peasants and artisans in the party and was spread by autonomous protest groups amongst the Catholic peasantry, whose ideas were not dissimilar to those of Otto Buckel. It was also shared by much of the church hierarchy for much the same reason. In the Vatican, religious and racial anti-Semitism merged in some of the anti-Jewish diatribes published by clerical writers in a few of the most hardline ultramontane newspapers and magazines. Moreover, anti-Semitic prejudice was powerful enough in the higher reaches of society, the court, the civil service, the army, and the universities to constitute a permanent reminder to Jews that they were less than equal members of the German nation. The anti-Semites succeeded in placing the Jewish question on the political agenda so that at no time was Jewish participation in key social institutions not a matter for discussion and debate. Yet, this was all relatively low level, even by the standards of the time. A historian once speculated on what would happen if a time traveler from 1945 arrived back in Europe just before the First World War and told an intelligent and well-informed contemporary that within 30 years, a European nation would make a systematic attempt to kill all the Jews of Europe and exterminate nearly 6 million in the process. If the time traveler invited the contemporary to guess which nation it would be, the chances were that he would have pointed to France, where the Dreyfus affair had recently led Dreyfus or Dreyfus? Is it Dreyfus affair? Had recently led to a massive outbreak of virulent popular anti-Semitism. Or it might be Russia, where the Tsarist Black Hundreds had been massacring large numbers of Jews in the wake of the failed revolution of 1905. That Germany, with its highly acculturated Jewish community and its comparative lack of overt or violent political anti-Semitism, would be the nation to launch this exterminatory campaign would hardly have occurred to him. Anti-Semitic politics were still very much on the fringe. But some of the anti-Semites' propaganda claims were beginning to gain a hearing on the political mainstream. For example, the idea that something called the Jewish spirit was somehow subversive, or that Jews had supposedly excessive influence in areas of society, such as journalism and the law. Moreover, the anti-Semitic parties had introduced a new, rabble-rousing, demagogic style of politics that had freed itself from the customary restraints of political decorum. This, too, remained on the fringes, but, here again, it had now become possible to utter in parliamentary sessions and electoral meetings hatreds and prejudices that in the mid-19th century would have been deemed utterly inappropriate in public discourse. What the 1880s and early 1890s were essentially witnessing, in addition to this domestication of anti-Semitism, was the assembling, on the fringes of political and intellectual life, of many of the ingredients that would later go into the potent and eclectic ideological brew of National Socialism. A key role in this process was played by anti-Semitic writers like the popular novelist Julius Langmann, whose book, Rembrandt as Educator, published in 1890, declared the Dutch artist Rembrandt, right? To be a classic North German racial type, and pleaded for German art to return to its racial roots, a cultural imperative that would later be taken up with great enthusiasm by the Nazis. A Rembrandt. Rembrandt? It's a Rembrandt. Rembrandt. Wait, fuck. Ugh. How do you say this fucker's name?
Rembrandt.
Rembrandt. It is Rembrandt. Cringe. Okay. These authors developed a new language of vehemence and violence in their diatribes against the Jews. The Jews, for Langmann, were a poison for us, and will have to be treated as such. The Jews are only a passing plague and a cholera, as he put it in 1892. Langmann's book went through 40 reprints in little over a year and continued to be a bestseller long after, combining scurrilous attacks on what its author called Jews and idiots, Jews and scoundrels, Jews and whores, Jews and professors, Jews and DGGers, Jews and Berliners, with a call for the restoration of a hierarchical society led by a secret Kaiser who would one day emerge from the shadows to restore Germany to its former glory. Such ideas were taken up and elaborated by the circle that gathered around the widow of the composer Richard Wagner at Bayreuth. Wagner had made his home in his in this North Bavarian town until his death in 1883, and his epic music dramas were played every year in the opera house he had constructed specifically for the purpose. They were designed not least to propagate pseudo-Germanic national myths in which heroic figures from Nordic legend were to serve as model leaders for the German future. Wagner himself had already been a cultural anti-Semite in the early 1850s, arguing in his notorious book, Judaism in Music, that the Jewish spirit was inimical to musical profundity, I think. His remedy was for the complete assimilation of Jews into German culture and the replacement of the Jewish religion, indeed all religion, by secular aesthetic impulses of the sort he poured into his own music dramas. But towards the end of his life, his views took on an increasingly racist tone under the influence of his second wife, Cosima, daughter of the composer Franz Liszt. By the end of the 1870s, she was recording in her diaries that Wagner, whose outlook on civilization was distinctly pessimistic by this time, had read Wilhelm Marr's anti-Semitic tract of 1873 and broadly agreed with it. As a consequence of this shift in his position, Wagner no longer desired the assimilation of the Jews into German society, but their exclusion from it. In 1881, discussing Lessing's classic play, Nathan the Wise, and a disastrous fire in the Vienna Ring Theater, in which more than 400 people, many of them Jewish, had died. Damn. Cosima noted that her husband said, in a vehement quip, that all Jews should burn at a performance of Nathan. After Wagner's death, his widow turned Bayreuth into a kind of shrine at which a band of dedicated followers would cultivate the dead master's sacred memory. The views of the circle she gathered around her at Bayreuth were rabidly anti-Semitic. The Wagner circle did its best to interpret the composer's operas as pitting Nordic heroes against Jewish villains, although his music was, of course, capable of being interpreted in many other ways as well. Among its leading figures were Ludwig Schiemann, a private scholar who translated Gobineau's treatise on racial inequality into German in 1898, and the Englishman Houston Stewart Chamberlain, born in 1855, who married one of Wagner's daughters and in due course published an admiring biography of the great man. While Cosima and her friends propagated their ideas through the periodical publication of Bayreuth papers, Schiemann went round the country addressing anti-Semitic meetings and founding a variety of radical racist organizations, most notably the Gobineau Society, 1894. None of them was particularly successful, but Schiemann's championing of the French racial theorist still did a great deal to bring Gobineau's term Aryan into vogue among German racists. Oh, I'm sure why not. Originally used to denote the common ancestors of the speakers of Germanic languages, such as English and German, the term soon acquired a contemporary usage, as Gobineau put forward his argument that racial survival could only be guaranteed by racial purity, such as was supposedly preserved in the German or Aryan peasantry, and that racial intermingling spelled cultural and political decline. It's pronounced Bayreuth. Bayreuth. Don't care. Sounds cringe. No one cares. It was Chamberlain who had the greatest impact, however, with his book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, published in 1900. In this vaporous and mystical work, Chamberlain portrayed history in terms of a struggle for the supremacy between the Germanic and Jewish races, the only two racial groups that retained their original purity in a world of miscegenation. Against the heroic and cultured Germans were pitted the ruthless and mechanistic Jews, whom Chamberlain thus elevated into a cosmic threat to human society, rather than simply dismissing them as a marginal or inferior group. Linked to the racial struggle was a religious one, and Chamberlain devoted a good deal of effort to trying to prove that Christianity was essentially Germanic and that Jesus, despite all the evidence, had not been Jewish at all. Chamberlain's work impressed many of his readers with its appeal to science in support of its arguments. His most important contribution in this respect was to fuse anti-Semitism and racism with social Darwinism. This is one of the big two prongs of, I guess, like the neo-Nazi stuff, right? That's cute. The English scientist Charles Darwin had maintained that the animal and plant kingdoms were subject to a law of natural selection in which the fittest survived and the weakest or least well adapted went to the wall, thus guaranteeing the improvement of the species. Social Darwinists applied this model to the human race as well. Here were assembled already, therefore, some of the key ideas that were later to be taken up by the Nazis. Chamberlain was not alone in putting forward such views. A variety of authors, scientists, and others contributed to the emergence in the 1890s of a new, tough, selectionist variant of social Darwinism, one that emphasized not peaceful revolution, but the struggle for survival. A characteristic represented of this school of thought was the anthropologist Ludwig Voltmann, who argued in 1900 that the Aryan or German race represented the height of human evolution and was thus superior to all others. Therefore, he claimed, the Germanic race has been selected to dominate the earth. But other races, he claimed, were preventing this from happening. The Germans, in the view of some, needed more living space. The German word was Lebensraum, and it would have to be acquired at the expense of others, most likely the Slavs. This was not because the country was literally overcrowded. There was no evidence for that. But because those who would advance such views were taking the idea of territoriality from the animal kingdom and applying it to human society. Alarmed by the growth of Germany's burgeoning cities, they sought the restoration of a rural idea in which German settlers would lord it over inferior Slav peasants, just as they had done, as historians were beginning to tell them, in East Central Europe in the Middle Ages. Such visions of international politics as an arena of struggle between different races for supremacy or survival had become common currency in Germany's political elite by the time of the First World War. Men such as War Minister Erich von Falkenhayn, Naval Secretary Alfred von Tirpitz, Reich Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg's advisor Kurt Reisler, and Chief of the Imperial Naval Cabinet Georg Alexander von Moeller all saw war as a means of preserving or asserting the German race against the Latins and the Slavs. War, as General Friedrich von Bernhardi famously put it in a book published in 1912, was a biological necessity. Without war, inferior or decaying races would easily choke the growth of healthy budding elements, and a universal decadence would follow. Foreign policy was no longer to be conducted between states, but between races. Here was one beginning of the downgrading of the importance of the state that was to play such an important role in Nazi foreign policy. Success in war and increasing preoccupation among Germany's leaders and politicians from the center to the right after the turn of the century also, for some, demanded the undertaking of positive steps to bring about the improvement of the race. One aspect of the selectionist turn in social Darwinism during the 1890s was to put greater emphasis than before on negative selection. It was all very well improving the race by better housing, healthcare, nutrition, hygiene, and sanitation, and similar policies, some argued, but this would do little to counteract the influence of society's abandonment of the principle of the struggle for survival by caring for the weak, the unhealthy, and the inadequate. Such a policy, argued some medical scientists, whose views were reinforced by the emergence of the fledgling science of genetics, was bringing about the increasing degeneracy of the human race. It had to be counteracted by a scientific approach to breeding that would reduce or eliminate the weak and improve and multiply the strong. Among those who argued along these lines was Wilhelm Schallmayer, whose essay advocating a eugenic approach to social policy won first prize in a national competition organized by the industrialist Alfred Krupp in 1900. Alfred Plotz was yet another medical man who thought that the height of human evolution so far had been reached by the Germans. He suggested that inferior specimens should be sent to the front if a war came, so that the unfit would be eliminated first. Most widely read of all was Ernst Haeckel, whose popularization of Darwinian ideas, The Riddle of the World, became a runaway bestseller when it was published in 1899. It would be a mistake to see such views as forming a coherent or unified ideology, however, still less one that pointed forward in a straight line to Nazism. Schallmayer for instance, was not anti-Semitic, and he vehemently rejected any idea of the superiority of the Aryan race. Nor was Voltmann hostile towards Jews, and his fundamentally positive attitude towards the French Revolution, whose leaders he somewhat implausibly claimed were racially Germanic, like all great historical figures, was far from congenial to the Nazis. For his part, Haeckel certainly argued that capital punishment should be used on a large scale to eliminate criminals from the chain of heredity. He also advocated the killing of the mentally ill through the use of chemical injections and electrocution. Haeckel was a racist, too, and pronounced the verdict that no woolly-haired race had ever achieved anything of historical importance. But on the other hand, he thought that war would be a eugenic catastrophe because it would kill off the best and bravest young men in the country. As a consequence, Haeckel's disciples, organized in the self-styled Monist League, became pacifists, rejecting the idea of war altogether. Not a doctrine that would endear them to the Nazis. Many of them would suffer dearly for their principles when war finally came in 1914. Okay. The nearest any of this came to prefiguring Nazi ideology was in the writings of Plurz, who spiced his theories with a strong dose of anti-Semitism and collaborated with Nordic supremacist groups. Still, before the First World War, there seems little evidence that Plurz himself considered the Aryan race superior to others, although one of his closest collaborators, Fritz Lenz, certainly did. Plurz took a ruthlessly meritocratic line on eugenic planning, arguing, for example, that a panel of doctors should attend all births and determine whether the baby was fit to survive or should be killed as weak and inadequate. The Darwinist Alexander Till openly advocated the killing of the mentally and physically unfit, and agreed with Plurz and Schallmayer that children's illnesses should be left untreated so that the weak could be eliminated from the chain of heredity. In 1905, Plurz and his sometime brother-in-law, the like-minded Ernst Rudin, founded the Racial Hygiene Society to propagate their views. It rapidly gained influence in the medical and welfare professions. Gabinu had been in many ways a conservative, and thought that the eugenic ideal was embodied in the aristocracy. These German thinkers took a far tougher and potentially more revolutionary line, often regarding hereditary traits as largely independent of social class. By the eve of the First World War, their ideas had spread in one form or another to areas such as medicine, social work, criminology, and the law. Social deviants such as prostitutes, alcoholics, petty thieves, vagrants, and the like were increasingly regarded as hereditarily tainted. And calls amongst experts for such people to be forcibly sterilized had become too loud to escape attention. Such was the influence of these ideas on the welfare establishment that even the Social Democrats could take seriously the proposal of Alfred Grotzen to link housing and welfare improvements with the compulsory sterilization of the insane, the work-shy, and the alcoholic. Developments such as these reflected the growing influence of the medical profession over rapidly growing specialisms such as criminology and social work. The triumphs of German medical science in discovering the bacilli that caused diseases such as cholera and tuberculosis in the 19th century had given it unparalleled intellectual prestige, as well as inadvertently furnishing anti-Semites with a whole new language in which to express their hatred and fear of the Jews. As a result, it had brought about a widespread medicalization of society in which ordinary people, including an increasing proportion of the working class, had begun to adopt hygienic practices such as washing regularly, disinfecting bathrooms, buying crypto from Donald Trump, boiling drinking water, and so on. The concept of hygiene began to spread from medicine to other areas of life, including not only social hygiene, but also, crucially, racial hygiene. To be sure, for all the discussion and debate over these issues, the effect that such ideas had on government policies and their implementations before 1914 was not very great. Beyond the scientific establishment, propagandists for the breeding of a blonde Aryan super race, such as the self-styled Lanz von Liebenfels, editor of Ostera, newspaper for blonde people, appealed only to an underworld of extremist politics and tiny, eccentric political sects. Nevertheless, despite all these qualifications, the emergence of these ideas, together with the increasing role they played in public debate, was a significant element in the origins of Nazi ideology. Several fundamental principles united virtually everyone in this motley crew of scientists, doctors, and propagandists for racial hygiene. The first was that heredity played a significant role in determining human character and behavior. Oh, crazy. This is our neo-Nazi shit. Right? Phenotype emerges from genotype. The phenotype of culture emerges from genes. The second, which followed on from this, was that society, led by the state, should manage the population in order to increase national efficiency. The fit had to be persuaded or forced to breed more, the unfit to breed less. Thirdly, however these terms were understood, the racial hygiene movement introduced an ominously rational and scientific categorization of people into those who were valuable to the nation and those who were not. Low quality, the German term was minderwertig, literally worthless, became a stock term used by social workers and medical men for many kinds of social deviant before the First World War. By labeling people in this way, the racial hygienists opened the way towards the control, the abuse, and finally the extermination of the valueless by the state through measures such as forcible sterilization and even execution, which some of them at least were already advocating before 1914. Finally, such a technocratically rationalist approach to population management presupposed an entirely secular, instrumental approach to morality. Christian precepts such as the sanctity of marriage and parenthood, or the equal value of every being endowed with an immortal soul, were thrown out the window. Whatever else such ideas were, they were not traditional or backward-looking. Indeed, some of the proponents, such as Voltmann and Schallmeyer, thought of themselves as being on the left rather than the right of the political spectrum, although their ideas were shared by very few of the Social Democrats. Fundamentally, racial hygiene was born of a new drive for society to be governed by scientific principles irrespective of all other considerations. It represented a new variant of German nationalism, one which was never likely to be shared by conservatives or reactionaries, or endorsed by the Christian churches, or indeed by any form of organized or established religion. Okay. Both anti-Semitism and racial hygiene were to be key components of Nazi ideology. They were both part of a general secularization of thought in the late 19th century, aspects of a far wider rebellion against what increasing numbers of writers and thinkers were coming to see as the stolid and stultifying complacency of the liberal bourgeois attitudes that had dominated Germany in the middle part of the century. The self-satisfaction of so many educated and middle-class Germans at the achievement of nationhood in the 1870s was giving way to a variety of dissatisfactions born of a feeling that Germany's spiritual and political development had come to a halt and needed pushing forward again. These were expressed forcefully by the socialist Max Weber's inaugural lecture, in which he dubbed the unification of 1871 a youthful prank of the German nation. The most influential prophet of such views was the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who railed in powerful, punchy prose against the ethical conservatism of his day. Nietzsche. It's Nietzsche, right? Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche. I've heard Nietzsche. Fuck these German names. Nietzsche. In many ways, he was comparable. In many ways, he was a comparable figure to Wagner, whom he hugely admired for much of his life. Like Wagner, he was a complex figure whose work was capable of being interpreted in a wide variety of senses. His writings argued for the individual to be freed from the conventional moral restrictions of the time. They were commonly interpreted before 1914 as a call for personal emancipation. They had a strong influence on a variety of liberal and radical groups, including, for example, the feminist movement, where one of the most imaginative figures, Helene Stocker, penned numerous essays in sub-Nietzschean prose, declaring the master's message to be that women should be free to develop their own sexuality outside marriage with the aid of mechanical contraceptives and equal rights for illegitimate children. Yet others took a different lesson altogether from the writings of the great philosopher. Nietzsche was a vigorous opponent of anti-Semitism who was deeply critical of the vulgar worship of power and success, which had resulted, in his view, from the unification of Germany by military force in 1871, and his most famous concepts, such as the will to power and the Superman, were intended by him to apply only to the sphere of thought and ideas, not to politics or action. But the power of his prose allowed such phrases to be reduced all too easily to slogans, ripped from their philosophical context, and applied in ways of which he would have greatly disapproved. His concept of an ideal human being, freed from moral constraints and triumphing through willpower over the weak, could be appropriated without too much difficulty by those who believed, as he did not, in the breeding of the human race according to racial and eugenic criteria. Sure. Central to such interpretations was the influence of his sister, Elizabeth Forster, who vulgarized and popularized his ideas, emphasizing their brutal, elitist aspects and made them palatable to extreme right-wing nationalists. Writers such as Ernst Bertram, Alfred Baumler, and Hans Gunther reduced Nietzsche to a prophet of power and his concept of the Superman to a plea for the coming of a German leader unfettered by moral constraints or Christian theology. Others, drawing on German anthropological studies of indigenous societies in New Guinea and other parts of the German colonial empire, took Nietzsche's spiritual elitism a step further and called for the creation of a new society ruled by a band of brothers, an elite of vigorous young men who would rule the state rather like a medieval knightly brotherhood. In this deeply misogynistic view of the world, women would have no role to play except to breed the elite of the future, a belief shared in less radical ways by many of the eugenicists and racial hygienists. Hygienists, right? Hygienists. Academic writers like Heinrich Schurz propagated the ideology of the Band of Brothers through a variety of publications, but it had its greatest effect in areas such as the youth movement, in which young, mostly middle-class men devoted themselves to hiking, communing with nature, singing nationalist songs around campfires, and pouring scorn on the state politics, hypocritical morality, and social artificiality of the adult world. Writers such as Hans Bleuer, strongly influenced by the youth movement, went to even greater extremes in their plea for the state to be reorganized along anti-democratic lines and led by a close-knit group of heroic men united by homoerotic ties of love and affection. Advocates of such ideas already began to found pseudo-monastic conspiratorial organizations before the First World War, notably the Germanic Order, established in 1912. In the world of such tiny secular sects, Aryan symbolism and ritual played a central role, as their members reclaimed ruins and sun worship as essential signs of Germanness, and adopted the Indian symbol of the swastika as an Aryan device under the influence of the Munich poet Alfred Schuller and the race theorist Lanz von Liebenfels, who flew a swastika flag from his castle in Austria in 1907. Strange though ideas like these were, their influence on many young middle-class men who passed through the youth movement organizations before the First World War should not be underestimated. If nothing else, they contributed to a widespread revolt against bourgeois convention in the generation born in the 1890s and the 1900s. What such currents of thought emphasized was in sharp contrast to the bourgeois virtues of sobriety and self-restraint, and diametrically opposite to the principles on which liberal nationalism rested, such as freedom of thought, representative government, tolerance for the opinions of others, and the fundamental rights of the individual. The great majority of Germans still most probably believed in these things at the turn of the century. Certainly, Germany's most popular political party, the Social Democrats, regarded itself as the guardian of the principle which the German liberals, in their view, had so signally failed to defend. The liberals themselves were still very much a force to be reckoned with, and there were even signs of a modest liberal revival in the last years of peace before 1914, but already by this time, serious attempts had begun to weld together some of the ideas of extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, and the revolt against convention into a new synthesis and to give it organizational shape. The political maelstrom of radical ideologies out of which Nazism would eventually emerge was already swirling powerfully well before the First World War. Wow. Damn. I'm kind of worried for these guys. It seems like if they keep on this path, it's going to be some bad shit.